Subcommittee on Communications and Technology and the Subcommittee on Consumer Protections and Commerce are holding a joint hearing entitled "A Country in Crisis: How Disinformation is Dividing the Nation." Due to the COVID-19 public health emergency, today's hearing is being held remotely. All members and witnesses will be participating via video conferencing. As a part of our hearing, microphones will be set on mute for the purpose of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members and witnesses, you will need to unmute your microphone each time you wish to speak. Documents for the record can be sent to Chloe Rodriguez at the email address we provided to staff. All documents will be entered into the record at the conclusion of the hearing. Chair will now recognize himself for a 5-minute opening statement. Good morning, and welcome to today's joint hearing on disinformation and the crisis it is creating in our country and for our democracy. I want to thank our panel of witnesses for joining us virtually today. While the committee has held several virtual hearings so far, this is the first one I have chaired, so please bear with me as we get through this. The matter before the committee today is one of pressing importance: the flood of disinformation online, principally distributed by social media companies, and the dangerous and divisive impact it is having on our nation as we endure the COVID-19 epidemic. Over 120,000 Americans have already lost their lives to this virus, and nearly 2.4 million Americans have been infected. Tens of millions of people are out of work as we attempt to stop the spread of this virus and prevent an even greater disaster. In the midst of this historic crisis, we are also facing a historic opportunity. Tens of millions of Americans are calling for racial justice and systematic changes to end racism and police brutality in the wake of the horrific murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and countless other Black Americans at the hands of law enforcement. Black Lives Matter movement has resulted in protests around the globe and online as people are taking to the streets, to social media to express their support for change. But as we march for progress and grapple with this deadly disease, the divisions in our country are growing. While our nation has long been divided, today we see that much of this division is driven by misinformation distributed and amplified by social media companies, the largest among them being Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. These platforms have become central to the daily lives of so many around the globe and to the way people get their news, interact with each other, and engage in political discourse. Our nation and the world are facing a heretofore unprecedented tsunami of disinformation that threatens to devastate our country and the world. It has been driven by hostile foreign powers seeking to weaken our democracy and divide our people, by those in our country who seek to divide us for their own political gain, and by social media companies themselves who have put profits before people as platforms have become awash in disinformation and their business models have come to depend on these engaging and enraging nature of these false truths. When Congress enacted Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act in 1996, this provision provided online companies with a sword and a shield to address concerns about content moderation and a website's liability for hosting third-party content. And while a number of websites have used 230 for years to remove sexually explicit and overtly violent content, they have failed to act to curtail the spread of disinformation. Instead, they have built systems to spread it at scale and to monetize the way it confirms our implicit biases. Everyone likes to hear and read things that confirm what they think is true. And these companies have made trillions of dollars by feeding people what they want to hear. As a result, these platforms have peddled lies about COVID-19, Black Lives Matter, voting by mail, and much, much more. When companies have done the right thing and stepped up to take down disinformation, they have been attacked by those who have benefited from it. Recently, Twitter labeled a number of tweets by President Trump as inaccurate, abusive, and glorifying violence. In response, President Trump issued an executive order threatening all social media companies. The Department of Justice have issued similarly thuggish proposals as well. The intent of these actions is clear: to bully social media companies into inaction. Social media companies need to step up to protect our civil rights, our human rights, and our human lives, not to sit on the sideline as the nation drowns in a sea of disinformation. Make no mistake, the future of our democracy is at stake, and the status quo is unacceptable. While Section 230 has long provided online companies the flexibility and the liability protections they need to innovate and to connect people from around the world, it has become clear that reform is necessary if we want to stem the tide of disinformation rolling over our country. That concludes my opening statement, and it now gives me great pleasure to recognize my good friend, Mr. Latta, ranking member for the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for holding today's hearing on disinformation online. And I also want to thank our witnesses for joining us today. We are living in a time when Americans increasingly rely on the internet in their daily lives. And while our nation is battling the coronavirus, having access to accurate information can mean the difference between life and death. But as we all know, not everything we see and read online can be taken as fact due to inaccuracies or outright lies. I have some folks that have told me that everything that on the internet is true because you can't put anything on the internet that wouldn't be true. So that's what some people were dealing. To date, companies have worked to police their platforms to remove harmful or inaccurate information online. In fact, Congress enacted Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act to allow internet companies to do just that. The law was intended to encourage internet platforms, then interactive computer services like CompuServe and America Online to proactively take down offensive content without having the fear of being held liable for doing the right thing. Hateful and racist comments should have no place in our society or on our platforms, and Section 230 provides a tool for companies to make sure this doesn't happen. And while some companies use this shield for its intended purpose, it is concerning that we are seeing other abuse, Section 230, after being pressured by activist employees or advertisers to make Good Samaritan policies intended to fit their own political agenda. Many tech companies have benefited and grown because they are afforded CDA 230 protections. These protections have allowed them to become the true gatekeepers to the internet. But too often we see that they don't want to take responsibility for the content within those gates. Let me be clear, I am not advocating that Congress repeal the law, nor am I advocating for Congress to consider niche carve-outs that could lead to a patchwork of applicability of the law. Section 230 was enacted for a reason. It is unfortunate, however, that the courts took such a broad interpretation of Section 230, simply granting broad liability protection without platforms having to demonstrate that they are doing, and I quote, everything possible. Numerous platforms have hidden behind Section 230 to avoid litigation without having to take responsibility. Not only are Good Samaritans sometimes being selective in taking down harmful illegal activity, but Section 230 has been interpreted so broadly that bad Samaritans can skate by without accountability. Freedom of speech is a fundamental right upon which our democracy is built, and we must make sure these companies are not policing the free flow of speech, especially when it comes to political discussions, as they continue to operate online platforms. While we are talking about private companies, many of the concerns I've outlined here today could simply be addressed if these companies began to equitably and consistently enforce their terms of service. If companies have the time and resources to make the difficult, complex decisions over moderating conservative speech, then surely they can make the easy decisions when it comes to taking down illegal, hate, or racist content on their platforms. I hope reports of political bias among large internet platforms are not an indication of their prioritization of resources. If so, then we should consider congressional scrutiny over how Section 230 is being used in the marketplace. So, I will say it again, I do not believe repealing Section 230 is the answer, but I do believe these companies could need more oversight as to how they are making certain decisions related to their content moderation practices. What they choose to censor and what they don't. We should make every effort to ensure that companies are using the sword provided by Section 230 to take down offensive and lewd content, but that they keep their power in check when it comes to censoring political speech. Again, terms of services should be enforced equitably and consistently. I look forward to hearing from our today's witnesses, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Okay, I thank the gentleman. The chair now recognizes Ms. Schakowsky, chairwoman of the Subcommittee on Consumer Protection and Commerce, for 5 minutes for her opening statement. Jan, you need to unmute if you haven't.
Okay, do that all the time. Sorry. Thank you, Chairman Doyle. I am so glad to be doing a joint hearing with you, and I want to thank our distinguished panel for joining us today. Last fall, Chairman Doyle and I held a joint hearing on Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. Subsequently, my subcommittee held a hearing on unsafe products and fake reviews found online. At both hearings, industry representatives came and testified. Big Tech was here. And we heard that content moderation and consumer protection were really hard. And that industry could always do better. And they made promises, but they discouraged congressional action. I think they may have even apologized, as Big Tech typically does when it appears before this committee. Fast forward to 6 months later, and add a global health pandemic and nationwide protests against policies of brutal and racial inequities. And as we will hear today, it's an understatement to say that industry could still be doing better. The harms associated with misinformation and disinformation continue to fall disproportionately on communities of color who already suffer worse outcomes from COVID-19. At the same time, the president himself is continually spreading dangerous disinformation that Big Tech is all too eager to promote. No matter what the absolutists say about Section 230, it is not only about free speech and content moderation. If it were, our conversation today would be very different. Instead, Big Tech uses it as a shield to protect itself from liability when it fails to protect consumers from harm and from harmful public health or harms public health, and use it as a sword to intimidate cities and states when they consider legislation, as Airbnb did in 2016 when New York City was considering regulating its online rent market for private homes. The truth is, Section 230 protects business models and generates prolific scams, fake news, fake reviews, and unsafe counterfeit and stolen products. This was never the intent, and since both courts and the industry refuse to change it, Congress must do it. But we must do it in a responsible way. The president's recent actions are designed to kneecap platforms that fact check him and engage in, checking the time here, engage in what he claims is bias against conservative views. Let me be clear. The president is using his position to chill speech, and that is just wrong. We must encourage content moderation that fosters a safer and healthier online world. And don't be fooled by made up claims of bias against conservatives. Today, it seems there is a less of a bias against conservatives and rather a bias for conservatives. On June 19th, 9 of the 10 top performing political pages on Facebook were conservative pages, including Donald Trump for president, Ben Shapiro, Breitbart, and Sean Hannity. And as the New York Times reported over the weekend, Facebook, in particular, seems to enjoy a cozy relationship with the Trump administration, aided by Facebook's loyal Trump supporters, Joel Karp and Peter Thiel. I hope that Mr. Kaplan and Mr. Thiel will soon make it before Congress, make themselves available so that we can ask questions about the role that they play. I am just so anxious to hear from our witnesses, and I will yield back at this time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And now,
thank you. The gentlelady yields back her time. The chair now recognizes Ms. Rogers has yielded her time, I believe, to Mr. Guthrie. So, Mr. Guthrie, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank the chairs and the ranking members for holding this hearing and our distinguished panelists for being here. The coronavirus outbreak has shown us the true strength of American technology. As much of our world became digital, we saw innovation across the board, from doctors switching to telehealth services, to educators teaching students from afar, to friends and family connecting online more so than ever before. Through this explosion of innovation, we have seen the best in people, companies and individuals stepping up to adapt to our new world, and neighbors helping neighbors as we all go through this together. Sadly, it has also brought out the worst in some people. While social media and other online websites can be used to connect us with each other and to information, unfortunately, bad actors can also weaponize these platforms to further spread disinformation, putting Americans' health and security at risk. Social media platforms have responded to disinformation campaigns differently. Some have taken a more active approach to monitoring and removing such content, while others have allowed disinformation, misinformation, and offensive and intolerable comments to fester on their sites unchecked. In either case, I think we can all agree that better transparency regarding how these internal guidelines are determined, as well as the mechanisms by which such content is removed, and the appeals processes they have in place is needed. We must also ensure that social media companies are applying these standards fairly and not just labeling a differing opinion as disinformation. During this public health crisis, the Federal Trade Commission has continued its work protecting consumers, providing guidance to businesses, and protecting competition in the marketplace throughout the pandemic. They have issued dozens of warnings to individuals and entities marketing therapies and products that claim to prevent or treat COVID-19. Further, they have disseminated information with consumers on how to avoid such scams and verify information they come across online, which I have shared with my constituents. This information will continue to be vital as we navigate this unprecedented time. Looking forward, I believe that emerging technology has the potential to be useful in combating illicit content online and putting a stop to these bad actors. That's why I recently introduced the Countering Online Harms Act, which would direct the Federal Trade Commission to conduct a study on how artificial intelligence may be used to identify and remove harmful online content, such as disinformation campaigns, deepfakes, counterfeit products, and other deceptive and fraudulent content that is intended to scam or do harm. Further, my bill would require the FTC to submit a subsequent report to Congress with recommendations on how to implement solutions with AI to address those issues and recommendations for potential legislation. Throughout the coronavirus pandemic, we have tapped into America's innovative potential to solve many of our new problems. And I hope the Counterfeiting Online Harms Act will build on this innovation to help protect American consumers as more and more of our lives are conducted online. Thank you to all the witnesses for your participation today. I look forward to hearing your testimony. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit for the record Ranking Member McMorris's Rogers opening statement. And thank you again, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now, Mr. Pallone, has yielded his time equally between Mr. Butterfield and Ms. Blunt Rochester. So, Mr. Butterfield, you can start for the first 2.5 minutes and then yield to Ms. Rochester.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, for convening this hearing today on the role that social media and other online platforms have in spreading disinformation. Mr. Chairman, the ability for virtually anyone to post thoughts and pictures and videos to social media has shed light on many of the systemic injustices and disparities that exist both in our country and around the world. However, we have also witnessed those same platforms used by domestic and foreign actors to undermine our democracy through disinformation campaigns, making for the easy spread of false narratives that undermine the public's trust in institutions like the press and our governments. A disturbing pattern, Mr. Chairman, has emerged online, revealing that African Americans and other racial minorities are consistently targeted by those seeking to promote disinformation. It is now well established that in 2016, foreign actors targeted the African American community by way of social media in efforts to keep African Americans from voting in the presidential election. That is a fact. More recently, mass protests following the death of George Floyd have often been wrongfully categorized on social media as violent by those seeking to undermine their purpose. Further, in the midst of a pandemic that disproportionately impacts communities of color, falsehoods have been spread from our own president about the virus's treatment and testing and origins, deepening already existing divides and putting the public's health at considerable risk. Such attempts at disenfranchisement and deception have no place in a country where so many have fought bitterly and at such great cost to ensure that every American's voice is heard at the ballot box and in the public square, which has increasingly moved online. In order to achieve meaningful progress in the fight against disinformation online, it will take the full cooperation of policymakers, industry stakeholders, and regulators to achieve our goal of an equitable online landscape that fosters healthy discourse without also promoting and protecting the civil rights of all users. That's what Ms. Schakowsky was talking about a few minutes ago, and I want to completely associate myself with her words. At this time, Mr. Chairman, as you mentioned in the outset, I will yield the balance of my time for my friend from the state of Delaware, Congresswoman Lisa Blunt Rochester.
Thank you, Mr. Butterfield, for yielding. Last October, the Energy and Commerce Committee considered whether social media companies have done enough to control hate speech, voter suppression activities, and blatantly false information on their platforms. Less than a year later, we are faced with a pandemic, record level unemployment, and Americans across the country demanding real action now on police violence and racial inequality. Yet social media companies have failed to prevent white nationalists, scammers, and other opportunists from using their platforms to exacerbate these crises. Notably, the largest platform, Facebook, stands out as the most irresponsible platform. 2020 is a defining year for our democracy. Facebook and the other platforms have a responsibility to the country to get their act together and to be a part of the solution and not the problem. Thank you, and I yield back. Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Chairman, you're muted. We can't hear you.
I'm sorry. At this time, the chair will recognize Ms. Brooks, who is being yielded Mr. Walden's time. Ms. Brooks, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Walden is at Rules Committee, so I have been asked to read his statement. So, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I welcome and thank all our witnesses for joining us today to discuss online misinformation. The internet is both a tool for good and evil. It allows Americans to work and learn from home, gives us unlimited access to information, helps connect us to our loved ones, and strengthens our economy. The United States is a global leader in innovation and home to the most advanced technology companies in the world. The internet has also empowered bad actors to promote online scams, post harmful and offensive content, and globally disseminate disinformation for free. Often, social media posts have become a cancer on civility, literally destroying reputations and lives with one click. It's revolting to see what some people post online, something I can tell you from personal experience in this public position. But we all know it's hard to regulate speech, especially in a democracy and with protections we're afforded under the First Amendment. We also know there are boundaries and limits. But over the course of our history, we've never had so much power to regulate speech concentrated in so few in the private sector, and with the broad immunity protection they have under Section 230. As we battle COVID-19, access to factual information is more important now than ever. However, we still see misinformation spread on platforms. I know the Trump administration has aggressively gone after bad actors, but as soon as you take down one site or profile, another one pops up. It's a global battle. We're in the midst of a national fight for equality and justice. At the same time, we see bigots post unacceptable, racist, and offensive comments online. These comments have no place in our society. Congress expects internet companies to monitor their platforms and take down false, misleading, and harmful content. That's why Congress enacted Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which provides liability protection to companies that take down content on their platforms. Last fall, this committee held a hearing to re-examine Section 230. I said then and will say again, many concerns can be addressed if these companies simply do what they say they will do, enforce their terms of service. However, recent actions taken by these companies trouble me. Twitter recently enacted new policies that seemingly target President Trump. Meanwhile, tweets that actually advocate violence are not flagged. Questions remain about who makes these decisions. Google took action against The Federalist for allegedly violating Google's ad policy on comment sections, not for the content of its articles, as NBC initially claimed. Significant questions persist as to whether Google followed their procedures and notified The Federalist directly. Moreover, why was this publication targeted and not others? I think I can speak for everyone on this committee when I say we do not support harmful or racist rhetoric or disinformation online. We expect these companies to do their best to flag or remove offensive and misleading content. But we also expect these immensely powerful platforms to follow their own processes for notifying users when they have potentially violated those policies and to enforce policies equitably. But that does not appear to have happened of late. That is why I've prepared legislation that will mandate more transparency from online platforms about their content practices. This would require these companies to file reports with the FTC so it is clear whether they are complying with their own terms of service and to bring transparency to their appeal process. I hope this can be bipartisan legislation. This is a straightforward bill that only impacts companies with revenues over $1 billion, so I hardly think it will crash the internet. I realize given a mix of human review and artificial intelligence, these platforms are not always going to get it right, but they absolutely must be more transparent. The power to regulate speech in America is cloaked more and more in secret algorithms and centralized in the hands of a powerful few in the private sector. We've never needed transparency and accountability more. Freedom-loving Americans have far too much at stake for us to let internet companies go unchecked. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back, and I want to thank her. I now want to introduce our witnesses for today's hearing. Ms. Brandy Collins-Dexter, Senior Campaign Director at Color of Change. Dr. Haney Farid, Professor, University of California, Berkeley. Mr. Neil Freed, former Chief Counsel for Communications and Technology on the Energy and Commerce Committee and Principal at Digital Frontiers Advocacy. and Mr. Spencer Overton, President of the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies and Professor of Law at George Washington University. We want to thank all of our witnesses for joining us today. We look forward to your testimony. At this time, the chair will recognize each witness for 5 minutes to provide their opening statement. And Ms. Collins-Dexter, you are now recognized for 5 minutes. And if you unmute. Ms. Collins-Dexter.
Hi.
You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good day, Chairman Pallone, Ranking Member Walden, Chairman Doyle, Ranking Member Latta, Chair Schakowsky, Ranking Member McMorris-Rogers, and members of the subcommittee. I am Brandy Collins-Dexter, Senior Campaign Director at Color of Change and a visiting fellow at Harvard Kennedy Shorenstein Center, working on documenting racialized disinformation campaigns. For Black communities, uncertainty is driven by distrust of mainstream media and a history of trauma from interactions with powerful institutions ranging from Madison to law enforcement to federal, state, and local governments. Many of us have turned to social media as our church, our office water cooler, and our political home. But unlike a physical space like a church or office, online, you often don't know who is standing next to you, who is giving the sermon, or how your data and information may be weaponized against you. While many corporate actors claim they are protecting free speech, this is an illusion. Every day, companies make a choice about what's allowed and what's not. When companies say they are not willing to remove certain things, what they're really saying is that addressing white nationalism, disinformation, and anti-Blackness simply don't rise to a level of urgency for them. Tech companies have routinely failed to uphold societal values like transparency, accountability, and fairness. We have seen misinformation about COVID-19 that endangers Black lives. Back in February, Color of Change alerted Twitter to COVID-19 misinformation that was spreading in Black community. The company only revised standards to address the dangers of misinformation after increased pressure and evidence gathered by Color of Change and other groups. Other tech companies have been slower to respond. A pandemic video on YouTube suggesting that the pandemic is a false flag to force mandatory vaccines and microchips had 4.3 million views on YouTube and 930,000 engagements on Facebook. Every week, I sit on Zoom with my mom while she recounts various people in our family and friend network who have passed from COVID-related issues. So I feel acutely the danger from these type of lies. At Color of Change, we have collected hundreds and hundreds of complaints from our members about censorship, harassment, and vile racial threats that they have received on Facebook. On the platform, we often see conspiracy theories coupled with threats and calls to violence. The most popular of those conspiracy theories are those involving anti-Semitic tropes about George Soros and Black activist groups. The idea that Black people are puppets has been played up by white supremacists like David Duke to undermine the credibility and impact of Black organizations, but more beyond credibility, it puts our lives in physical danger. Members of Congress, please move quickly to fix our democracy before it's irretrievably broken. I urge you to convene a series of civil rights focused hearings with high-level executives from all major companies with particular focus on those trafficking and disinformation. Restore funding for the Office of Technology Assessment in order to help Congress tackle issues such as data privacy, tech election protection, and set up infrastructure that can facilitate deeper investment in US-based innovation and entrepreneurship to combat disinformation and other data hostile practices. Ensure that regulators have every power at their disposal to ensure the safety of consumers and users on tech platforms. We support a consumer watchdog agency that is resourced to ensure we are all able to have control and protection of our data and that there is a competitive digital marketplace. And finally, Congress should affirmatively empower and resource the Federal Trade Commission to enforce antitrust laws against technology oligarchs. The sheer amount of data and information amassed by tech companies, the inability of companies like Facebook and Google to be regulated at scale, and the stakes online, in the voting booth, and on our streets require actionable steps towards breaking up companies. Congress is charged with making decisions, policies, and laws that make real our joint aspiration for a more perfect union that establishes justice, ensures domestic tranquility, provides for the common defense, and promotes the general welfare so that the blessings of liberty can ring true for all of us. This cannot happen when democracy is corrupted. Uncontrolled tech companies pose significant threats to democracy and freedom in the US and around the world. We must move with collective urgency to ensure that our data and physical bodies are protected on and offline. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for your testimony. The chair now recognizes Dr. Fareed. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairs, ranking members, and members of both subcommittees, thanks for the opportunity to speak with you today on these incredibly important issues. Technology and the internet have had a remarkable impact on our lives and society. Many educational, entertaining, and inspiring things have emerged from the past 2 decades in innovation. But at the same time, many horrific things have emerged. A massive proliferation of child sexual abuse material, the spread and radicalization of domestic and international terrorists, the distribution of illegal and deadly drugs, the proliferation of mis- and disinformation campaigns designed to sow civil unrest, incite violence, and disrupt democratic elections, the proliferation of dangerous, hateful, and deadly conspiracy theories, the routine harassment of women and underrepresented groups in the forms of threats of sexual violence and revenge and non-consensual pornography, small to large-scale fraud, and spectacular failures to protect the personal and sensitive data. How in 20 years did we go from the promise of the internet to democratize access to knowledge and make the world more understanding and enlightened to this litany of daily horrors? Due to a combination of naivete, ideology, willful ignorance, and a mentality of growth at all costs, the titans of tech have simply failed to install proper safeguards on their services. We can and we must do better when it comes to contending with some of the most violent, harmful, dangerous, hateful, and fraudulent content online. We can and we must do better when it comes to contending with misinformation apocalypse that has emerged over the past few years. The COVID global pandemic, for example, has been an ideal breeding ground for online misinformation. Social media traffic has reached an all-time record as people are forced to remain at home, often idle, anxious, and hungry for information. The resulting spike in COVID-related misinformation is of grave concern to health professionals. The World Health Organization, for example, has listed this infodemic in its top priorities to contain the pandemic. Over the past few months, we have measured a troublingly wide reach and belief in COVID-related misinformation that is highly partisan and is more prevalent in those that consume news primarily on social media. We find that the amount of misinformation believed by those with social media as their main source of news is 1.4 times greater than others. And the amount of misinformation believed by those on the right of the political spectrum is 2 times greater than those on the left. Even prior to the current pandemic, the FBI announced last year that fringe conspiracy theories are a domestic terrorist threat due to the increasing number of violent incidents motivated by such beliefs. At the same time, YouTube continues to knowingly and actively promote fringe and dangerous conspiracies. At its peak in late 2018, we measured that almost 10% of recommended videos on YouTube's informational and news channels were conspiratorial in nature. Because 70% of all watched videos on YouTube are recommended by YouTube, their recommendation algorithm is responsible for the spread of conspiracies and misinformation. Now, Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg has tried to frame the issue of reining in mis and disinformation as not wanting to be the arbiter of truth. This entirely misses the point. The point is not only about truth or falsehood, but about algorithmic amplification. The point is that social media decides what is relevant by recommending it every day to their billions of users. The point is that social media has learned that outrageous, divisive, conspiratorial content increases engagement. The point is that online content providers could simply decide that they value trusted information over untrusted information, respectful over hateful, and unifying over divisive, and in turn fundamentally change the divisiveness fueling and misinformation distributing machine that is social media today. If advertisers that are the fuel behind social media took a stand against online abuses, they could withhold their advertising dollars to insist on real change. Standing in the way of this much needed change is a lack of corporate leadership, a lack of competition, a lack of regulatory oversight, and a lack of education among the general public. Responsibility, therefore, to regain civility and trust online falls on the private sector, government regulators, and we, the general public. Thank you, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank the gentleman for his testimony. The chair now recognizes Neil Fried. Neil, welcome back to the committee. Always good to see one of our own back to visit. You're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Pallone, Ranking Member Walden, Chairman Doyle, Ranking Member Latta, Chair Schakowsky, Ranking Member McMorris-Rogers, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify. After 10 years as Communications and Technology Counsel to this committee, it's an honor to be on this side of the witness table, albeit virtually. I've been involved in Section 230 debates for a while now, since 1999, and welcome the opportunity to share my views. Those views are my own. I have no client on Section 230 matters. I come not to bury Section 230, but to improve it. I recommend restoring a duty of care online by requiring platforms to take reasonable, good faith steps to prevent illicit use of their services as a condition of receiving Section 230 protection. This would better protect users as well as address competition concerns, and it would do so without regulating the internet, without taking away the platform's content moderation safe harbor, and without raising government censorship issues. Growing frustration with the internet stems in large part from the lack of accountability of platforms, as well as online intermediaries such as domain name providers and reverse proxy services. Increased transparency would help, as would legislation restoring access to the who is information needed to catch illicit actors. Fully realizing the internet we all aspire to, however, will also require recalibrating Section 230. So long as platforms can facilitate illicit activity with impunity, we are fighting a losing battle. Despite claims Section 230 encourages content moderation, it actually does the opposite. Congress gave platforms a content liability shield so they would wield a content moderation sword. Although Section 230C2 creates a safe harbor for content moderation, Section 230C1 eliminates liability even if the platforms don't moderate content. In other words, they reap the benefits of the shield even when they drop the sword. Thus, while Section 230C is called the Good Samaritan provision, it still protects platforms when they behave like bad Samaritans, profiting from advertising around unlawful behavior while sitting on their hands without legal consequence. This is aggravating illicit activity online, everything from fraud to the spread of child pornography. Ordinarily, a business has a duty of care to prevent people from using its services to harm others. Section 230, however, eliminates this duty, even when the platforms negligently, recklessly, or willfully disregard illicit activity. This puts internet users in harm's way and often leaves victims without a remedy in light of the anonymous nature of the internet. The platforms say they are taking responsible steps to curb illicit activity. That may be true in some cases, but why should their judgment be beyond judicial scrutiny? Section 230 also affects competition by letting platforms avoid the ordinary business costs of preventing harm. This gives them an unfair advantage over their competitors. They can grow more recklessly in both scale and scope, which also gives them market power to negotiate aggressive terms in their favor. They can generate profit from advertising around illicit activity, and they can ignore harms that their users cause their competitors. One way to preserve the benefits of Section 230 while fixing its harms would be to restore a duty of care. This could be achieved by requiring platforms to take reasonable, good faith steps to curb illicit activity as a condition of receiving protection. Doing so would mean platforms do not enjoy protection when they negligently, recklessly, or knowingly facilitate illicit activity. Such a solution also avoids harms that critics attribute to Section 230 reform. First, it preserves the content moderation safe harbor the platforms say they need to continue carrying user-generated content. Second, it requires no new regulation of the internet. Platforms would still have discretion over their business models on the front end, but would appropriately be held accountable on the back end if they use that discretion poorly. That potential back-end accountability would prompt responsibility by design. Third, it doesn't rely on government-determined content rules, avoiding First Amendment claims. Fourth, any evaluation of reasonableness will factor in the resources available to a platform, ensuring smaller platforms are not unreasonably burdened as they try to grow. In the meantime, the U.S. should refrain from including Section 230 type language in trade deals. To do otherwise would export the harms we are experiencing here to foreign citizens and to U.S. companies abroad. And because the internet is global, lax standards abroad also harm U.S. citizens and businesses here. I thank the committee again for providing me the opportunity to appear today and welcome any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Freed. The chair now recognizes Mr. Overton for 5 minutes.
Thank you
Mr.
very
Overton,
much.
you're recognized.
Chair, ranking members, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify. My name is Spencer Overton. I'm the president of the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, which was founded in 1970 and is America's Black think tank. I'm also a tenured law professor at GW, specializing in voting rights, and I recently published academic research on voter suppression through social media. Disinformation on social media presents a real danger to democracy. Both domestic and foreign actors use disinformation to divide Americans along racial lines. They use data and psychology to play on people's deepest fears and create an us versus them discourse. According to a recent Gallup Knight Foundation survey, 81% of Americans believe that social media companies should never allow intentionally misleading information on elections and political issues. Section 230 clearly gives social media companies authority to remove disinformation, and they should use that authority to do a better job at stopping disinformation. So some social media companies, they'll say they don't remove disinformation because they want to protect speech or be viewpoint neutral. But the harms that result are not neutral for communities of color. For example, in 2016, you'll remember several Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube accounts looked like they were African-American operating, but in fact, they were operated by the Russian Internet Research Agency. At first, the fake accounts built trust by showcasing Black achievements. Later, they started posting on police violence and other structural inequalities. Then, near Election Day, after they had built a large following, the fake accounts urged Black voters to protest by boycotting the election and not voting. Now, we don't know how many Black voters stayed home because of this disinformation, but we do know that 2016 marked the most significant decline in Black voter turnout on record. Even though the Russians infiltrated different groups, variety of groups, conservative, liberal, Second Amendment, LGBT, Latino, policing, Muslim American groups, even though they did all that, this harm was not neutral for Black communities. For example, while Black people make up just 13% of the US population, Black audiences accounted for over 38% of the Facebook ads purchased by the Russians and almost half of the user clicks. Also, the Russian scheme discouraged voting among African Americans, right? But not those other groups. It's not neutral for our nation's most valuable companies to profit off of discrimination against historically marginalized communities. Now, recently, President Trump signed an executive order that attempted to increase the legal liability for social media companies that moderated objectionable content by President Trump and his followers. This type of retaliation discourages social media companies from stopping disinformation and allows for more disinformation that divides Americans. Although President Trump's executive order is problematic, right? The status quo just clearly, it is not working. The types of disinformation and voter suppression schemes we saw in 2016 are continuing in 2020. Facebook has even argued that federal civil rights laws don't apply to Facebook. Even in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd, there exists a real question about whether social media companies will address their own systemic shortcomings and fully embrace civil rights principles. I hope that social media companies will fully adopt these civil rights principles and use their existing legal authority to prevent disinformation and voter suppression. If legal reforms are needed, however, these debates should occur in Congress and should include the voices of communities of color who've been disproportionately harmed by targeted voter suppression and other disinformation campaigns. Thank you, and I look forward to our discussion today.
Thank you very much. I want to thank all the panelists for their testimony and note for the record that they all were able to do it under 5 minutes. So we on the committee will endeavor to follow their good example and not take any longer than 5 minutes for our questions. So we're going to move on to member questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to ask questions of our witnesses, and I will start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Ms. Collins-Dexter, in your testimony, you talked about the dangers of tech companies' reluctance to regulate disinformation from prominent figures. Recently, Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg defended his decision not to moderate inaccurate statements made by President Trump regarding voting by mail and his glorification of violence when he said people protesting the murder of George Floyd, when the looting starts, the shooting starts. Those words have a long history of abetting bigotry and police brutality in this country. Just yesterday, the president threatened protesters in Washington, D.C. with violence. What are online platforms culpable for when they allow this kind of content to be posted and shared by their most prominent users? And what do you think the president's intent was when he signed the executive order to prevent online censorship, as the White House described it?
Thank you, Congressman. There's so much at stake with people's lives when disinformation is allowed to rule the day. And particularly, it doesn't matter when tech companies enforce the rules with people that have 10 or 20 or 100 followers, if the people that have thousands and millions of followers are allowed to peddle disinformation. And so in terms of vote by mail, we know for a fact that 80% of Americans support vote by mail. We've seen swells in voter turnouts in places like I live, like Baltimore. It has actually no impact on partisan turnout. I know that's not important to anyone here, but it's actually important for everybody in our democracy to be able to engage in the business of voting. And so when it's left up, all of these allegations that vote by mail is a fraud, it turns people off. It hinders our ability to have safe voting conditions in November while we're still dealing with COVID. And it really does do a disservice to, I think, the work that Congress is invested in ensuring that everybody can engage in our democracy. In terms of the threats, we personally have dealt with a increased number of threats to our lives as individuals and as an organization. I think Move On has actually found that after monitoring 25,000 comments in certain right-wing groups in particular, there were 207 calls to violence and murder that were actually identified, which I can share with folks if they're interested afterwards. But we see how things that are said online have a deep impact on our safety offline. As far as what the president, his thinking, I would hate to speculate what anybody thinks internally. But
I understand it, and you don't need to do that. I do want to ask Mr. Overton a question too before my time is up. Mr. Overton, in your recent law review article entitled "State Power to Regulate Social Media Companies to Prevent Voter Suppression in Minority Communities Using Targeted Ads on Facebook and Other Platforms," we saw and held hearings on the devastating effect of these efforts in 2016, and I have grave concerns about the 2020 election. You argue that the steps taken by online platforms to enable and tailor the targeting of protected classes, such as Black Americans, with paid advertisements and promoted posts constitutes a material contribution to the distribution of these ads and should make these online platforms liable under state voter suppression laws. Does Congress need to clarify Section 230 to make it clear that platforms that enable these kinds of civil rights violations are liable not only under federal law, but under state law as well?
Thank you so much. And you're absolutely right. we're not necessarily talking about the speech of the third parties, as you point out. We're talking about the platforms themselves. They are materially participating by using their algorithms to target communities of color. So an employment ad goes to white folks, but not to Black folks. Voter suppression ads target at Black folks and not other people. And that is materially participating in the discrimination, which is not immunity that 230 covers. So courts have not explicitly talked about that. And if Congress opens up 230, certainly it should make it explicitly clear that this type of behavior is not protected by 230. Unfortunately, Facebook has argued that it is protected and that they should be able to target ads away from Black communities and employment opportunities to just white folks.
Thank you. And I see my time has expired right on the button. I will now recognize my good friend, Mr. Latta, for his 5 minutes. You need to unmute, Bob. There you go.
Well, thanks, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank you again for holding today's hearing. And if I can start with Mr. Freed. This morning, I sent a letter to several federal agencies requesting information about how those agencies use information from the WHOIS database to combat illegal activity online. Due to the ambiguous and overly broad nature of the European Union's GDPR, access to WHOIS information has been restricted for many third-party organizations that use this information to identify bad actors online. Access to WHOIS is especially important during this pandemic, as we have seen an increase of online misinformation and fraud targeting consumers. First question, how did access to WHOIS information prior to the implementation of GDPR help in the takedown of illegal content?
Thank you, Mr. Latta. Two ways. One is fairly obvious. If you found someone engaging in illicit activity from a website, you could try and figure out who holds that website. So it's good in sort of catching those engaged in illicit activity. But what many people don't realize is it's also used to prevent illicit activity, because you can track patterns. If you see that a lot of illicit activity has occurred from a particular website or from certain people who are holding a website, what web managers can do is create sort of blacklists and say, we know that this actor is doing things nefarious. They're engaging in fraud, they're engaging in cyber attacks, and corporate or law enforcement can then proactively prevent those entities from creating further havoc. So it's both catching criminals and preventing crime.
Well, and also just to follow up then, because does withholding this access to the WHOIS information from certain groups reduce the action the domain name providers are able to take against that illegal content?
Yes, and so this is also very important. So obviously law enforcement is critical here, but law enforcement only has so many resources. There was a very large community of cyber experts that track illicit behavior, and they can often flag illicit activity, both that has already occurred or, as we just discussed, that may be happening soon, because they can see certain actors who have engaged in illicit activity in the past about to do something again, and they can warn public safety, law enforcement, that something is amiss, and you lose that as well. So without WHOIS, it really hurts the ability of domain name providers to release this information, at least because of the way the EU's GDPR is being over-applied.
Well, and just finally, could you briefly summarize the types of societal problems that could be better confronted by restoring the access to the WHOIS information?
Everything we're experiencing now, right? From fraud to illicit sale of drugs to cyber attacks, any illicit activity online often either has a website component or it has IP addresses that you can find through the WHOIS data. So any illicit activity, the scourge of misinformation, of fraud, of cyber attacks, all could be aided. Combating that could all be aided if we had better access to WHOIS data like we used to have.
Well, thank you. Mr. Faride, there is much discussion for companies to be transparent about their terms of service and how they enforce their policies. But recently, social media companies seem to be creating new policies ad hoc to fit their political agenda, arguably making these companies arbiters of speech on their platform. Both artificial intelligence and human review are important elements to ensure that harmful and illegal content gets taken down. But how do you address the human bias element to make sure that Americans are able to exercise their right to free speech?
I think the bias question is important, Congressman, and I think it's important for us to talk about it. Let me say that there is no compelling evidence that we have seen to date that shows that there is a consistent bias. You can always pick individual cases and show that there's a problem here or there, but the consistent disproportionate affecting of one group or another politically, we have not seen. So I think the answer to your question is we need transparency. We need transparencies in the rules. We need transparencies in how they're being enforced. We need better reporting. We need more consistency. And we need more investment. The fact is that the tech companies have not invested in the technologies and in the services they need to moderate their platforms because, frankly, it's bad for business. And so we need for them to put more effort into this and for it to be transparent and clear and consistent application of the rules. And without, as we've been talking about, real reform in 230, not removing it, as you said in your opening remark, but real reform, I think that's going to be very difficult to achieve.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My time is just set to expire, and I yield back the balance.
I thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes Ms. Schakowsky for 5 minutes. Need to unmute, Jan.
Okay. Mr. Fried, I just want to point out, you said that you hope that 230 and the liability shield would not be in foreign trade agreements. And as you know, because I know because I was on the working group, it is in the U.S., Canada, Mexico trade agreement. And I think we need to work in a bipartisan way to make sure that we are keeping it out of future agreements, because it will make it harder for us then to moderate 230. So I hope we can work together on that. As Mark Zuckerberg noted so clearly when he testified before Congress, Facebook and other social media platforms make money by selling ads. And in many of our consumer protection hearings, someone uses the now kind of cliche line, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. Simply put, the longer you stay on an app, the more money the company makes. And what gets and keeps people online, as Dr. Fareed noted in his testimony, content that is, quote, novel and provoking, unquote, such as conspiracy theories and snake oil, et cetera, and COVID-19 hoaxes and things about protesters draw viewers. So let me ask you, Dr. Fareed, can you discuss why many of the big platforms allow amplification of conspiracies and disinformation to happen, and how the business model seems to be benefiting them?
Thank you, Congresswoman. You said it absolutely right that social media is in the engagement and attention business. So they profit when we spend more time on the platform, they collect more data from us, and they deliver ads. They didn't set out to fuel misinformation and hate and divisiveness, but that's what the algorithms learned. So when you do A/B testing, if we show you this, do you spend more or less time on the platform? Algorithms have learned that the hateful, the divisive, the conspiratorial, the outrageous, and the novel keeps us on the platforms longer. And since that is the driving factor for profit, that's what the algorithms do. Now, they could change the algorithms. They could just say, look, it's not all about engagement. It's not all about profit. It's about a healthier ecosystem, democracy, and society. And they can just value something else in what they are optimizing for. But the core poison here, Congresswoman, which is what you're getting at, is the business model. The business model is that when you keep people on the platform, you profit more. And that is fundamentally at odds with our societal and democratic goals.
Thank you. We hear over and over again from big tech that, well, we're going to fix this. Self-regulation really works. And I personally don't think that's true. Congress routinely regulates commercial activity to prevent harmful products from being sold, stop fraud, and deter illegal discrimination. So when a company is profiting from its decisions to push counterfeit products or facilitating housing discrimination, they should be held accountable. So, Mr. Overton, and maybe we could also hear from Ms. Gallons Dexter. Do I have any time left? Yeah, I do. You testified that the statute, that the status, okay, let me try again. You testified that the status quo for Section 230 is not working to protect civil rights. Can you expand a little bit on the civil rights aspect?
Yes, thank you. So it's not working because, in part, the algorithms have a discriminatory impact and effect. Even when they take explicit racial groups and targeting out, they're still profiting from that in terms of employment. When we look in other areas, we see voter suppression that continues to exist. Something was just uncovered in terms of a group in Ghana and Nigeria targeting Black Americans with disinformation. So we see several examples. It's very unlike COVID. Certainly there was some misinformation with COVID, but the thought was, hey, there's public health here at stake. We really also need to be focused on the health of our democracy, and we need platforms to be serious about that.
Thank you.
Gentlelady's time has expired.
Yeah, so maybe we can talk offline. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Shimkus for 5 minutes. Is Mr. Shimkus here? Okay, let's go to Dr. Burgess. You're recognized for 5 minutes. Or, I'm sorry, is the chair here? Is Mr. Walden here? Is the chairman here? Is Mr. Walden here, Bob? Okay, Dr. Burgess, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Doyle, both Mr. Walden and Mr. Burgess are at Rules Committee at the moment.
Okay, is Mr. Shimkus present? Okay, are we down to what, Mr. Guthrie?
Mr. Guthrie.
Yeah, Mr. Guthrie,
That's me.
recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it very much.
I think we have members on in Rules Committee that apologize.
Yeah, they were. I'm standing by. Thank you very much. Dr. Fareed, my first question is for you. Welcome back to the committee. We like hearing from you and enjoy our discussions. But we often hear that there are difficult judgment calls on content moderation. Do you believe these large social media companies currently possess the technological means to better moderate illicit content on their platforms? And if they do, why aren't they using them?
Thank you, Congressman. Good to see you again and good to be back here. I don't actually think they have very good technology. It's not because the technology can't be developed, it's that they just haven't developed it. They haven't prioritized it. So I'll give you a couple of examples. On Facebook and on YouTube, you are not allowed to post adult legal pornography. Perfectly protected speech, by the way. And nobody gives Facebook and YouTube a hard time for eliminating that content, which they do, by the way, very effectively because it's bad for business. Advertisers don't want to advertise against that content. Copyright information. When the DMCA was passed, we got very good at removing copyright infringement because the law insisted on it. So when there has been an insistence to remove content or that it was important for businesses, the companies have actually gotten very good. They simply haven't prioritized misinformation, disinformation. And I'll also point out that it's not always entirely about either removing the content or not. It's also about the amplification. So what they could choose to do, even if they don't have the ability to detect fake news, misinformation, disinformation, is they could reprioritize the algorithms so that trusted information is brought on above untrusted information. So you can think about the problem in two ways. It's not about necessarily detecting fake information, but it's also could be about detecting trustworthy information or civil discourse. And so it's simply not a priority for them. And despite the claims, by the way, and they made the same claims about copyright infringement, but as soon as the laws were passed, well, they got really good at it. And they did the same case about child sexual abuse material. And when the public pressure escalated so much, they eventually started removing the content after years and years of denial that it was possible.
Well, that's very helpful. Thank you very much. And also, question you again. I appreciate your collaboration with Microsoft to develop photo DNA over a decade ago. When you work with these companies, what are the benchmarks you would advise these companies to meet, such as investment and personnel?
Yeah, that's a great question, Congressman. So, one of the hardest things with these companies is there's a lack of transparency. And so we don't know how much child sexual abuse material, how much terrorism material, how much illegal drugs and misinformation goes through their network. So the first thing is to really get good at reporting and understanding the flow of this information through your services so that as we deploy technologies, we can do better. So here's what I can tell you is that in all of the major companies, dealing with these things are not a priority. And so whether it's human moderators or whether it's research or whether it's technology deployment, it is simply not being prioritized. Now, the thing you will always hear is, well, we do this, we do this, we do this, and we do this. And the answer is that's fine. But what they're not telling you is what they're not doing. So I think a call for transparency on the flood of disinformation and harmful content is critical to this, and to reprioritize the priorities of the current companies so that we start dealing with the harmful content at least as effectively as we do for making money.
Okay, thank you. And I have about a minute left, so Mr. Freed, I'd like to ask you this. Appreciate your answers, Dr. Freed. Mr. Freed, where do you see emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence being used to help combat disinformation, particularly during situations like the current pandemic? Do you believe AI can be used to identify and remove illicit content from platforms such as disinformation campaigns and counterfeit products? I have about a minute for you to respond.
I would certainly never rule out any technological tool that can help. I would caution, depending on what kind of artificial intelligence you're talking about, like algorithms, right? These also can cause problems. Some of them got us in the mess we're in now. So absolutely, we should look at all the options, but with intelligence, we got the concerns as well as the benefits.
Okay, and I'll just follow up then. Do you believe that, Mr. Freed, do you believe that Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act creates a disincentive for platforms implementing artificial intelligence and other emerging technologies to address this?
So Professor Fareed hit on this already, which is that the law could increase the incentive to solve problems. And right now, because the liability protection applies even if they do nothing, there is less legal incentive for them to solve that problem.
So there's not a disincentive, just no incentive to do so.
There is less of a legal incentive, that is correct.
Thank you very much. So I have about 10 seconds left. Appreciate your answers. Appreciate you being here. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Rush for 5 minutes. Mr. Rush, you're recognized. Bobby, you need to unmute. Mr. Rush, if you can hear me, you need to unmute your microphone, and your video's off too, so you may want to check that also. Okay, I think we're going to go to Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, we'll recognize you for 5 minutes, and we'll come back to Mr. Rush if he gets back online. Mr. Butterfield. Isn't technology wonderful? Mr. Butterfield. Okay, Mr. Rush, can you hear me?
I certainly can. No, I can hear you and I can see you, Mr.
Okay,
Chairman.
you are now recognized for 5 minutes, my friend.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I'm delighted to participate in this hearing, and I want to welcome all of our witnesses. Ms. Collins Dexter, I've introduced COVID-19 testing reaching and contracting everyone, which is called the Trace Act, which is meant to provide contract tracing and testing in the face of this pandemic. We've got almost 70 co-sponsors. And this bill has been subject to an incredible amount of disinformation and distortions and frankly downright lies, all on social media platforms. This occurred primarily due to the bill's number, H.R. 6666, and the bill is focused, and these distortions was focused on the African American community. When my staff engaged tech companies to prevent the spread of this disinformation, they were told that the posts represent people expressing their opinions on legislation and therefore don't violate community guidelines. While I fully support a free and spirited discussion, I believe it's also important to recognize that disinformation can have real and significant consequences. I wonder then, where and how do we draw the line between opinion and disinformation?
Yes, I think it's extremely important that we draw that line. Thank you, Congressman. The difference of opinion is, I think taxes should go here versus, pay less taxes. And there's a number of ways in which we have to be invested in a free marketplace of ideas. But when it comes to information that's put forward that directly endangers people's lives on and offline, in the case of your bill, Congressman, we're seeing right now that from the data we do know that 60% of cases and up, depending on the state, of deaths from COVID-19 are Black people. There is a high number of stakes involved with the amount of disinformation we've seen floating around, and particularly when Congress people are trying to put forward bills that would increase the data and awareness of folks around this and other things. It's extraordinarily important that we do say that there's a difference between opinion and there's a difference between the need for facts in our society.
Yes, Ms. Dexter, Collins Dexter, AI trained. You stated in your testimony that, I quote, AI trained to identify hate speech may actually amplify racial bias. This is a great concern to me and many of my colleagues. What could and should Congress do to prevent and mitigate this outcome?
Yeah, so I think, again, like with the issue of AI, we've found time and time again racial bias in healthcare software, in crime software. Google's hate speech has a AI racial bias problem, as well as the technology that was used on Facebook. And so I think, and also we see that a lot of content moderators, our contractors, are not necessarily in the country and not able to really do their job at full scale. And so I think that, again, when I point to some of the ways in which I would see Congress moving forward, I think something like bringing back GAO would be really great to help ensure that Congress is informed and able to make good decisions around how to move forward on decisions like AI monitoring.
Mr. Chairman, I think that my time has been expired, and I yield back.
I want to thank the gentleman for yielding us back 43 seconds, setting such a good example. I can see my good friend John Shimkus on the screen. So, Mr. Shimkus, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a great hearing, and thank you for the panelists for being there. I want to direct my questions to Neil Freed. It's good to have and see him again, of course, working with the committee for many years. And I think we all can agree that some content decisions are complex, but you suggest companies have not met the bar when it comes to clearly illegal content or violation of terms of service. Do the current incentives under Section 230 encourage companies to proactively engage in enforcing their terms of service, or simply waiting for users to flag content?
Thank you, Mr.
So you're going to be right next after Shimkus. Microphone's live as well.
So despite the claim that it actually encourages content moderation, it doesn't. What it does do, right, in the safe harbor for content moderation, is it gets rid of the disincentive caused by the Prodigy case. But what that provision gives, essentially 230C1 takes away by saying you can't be held liable for anything anyway. So that actually, by no incentive to be legal incentive to be proactive.
Okay, we had some interruption there. So, but let me just follow up. And if companies decide to engage proactively, how do those incentives prevent the engagement from being entirely one-sided at the whim of the employees making those decisions?
So the discretion is completely theirs. There is no, most every other business who's not a platform will have some duty of care. They could be held culpable if they act recklessly. That does not apply to the platforms. So that it is completely within their discretion. There was not a legal incentive for them to actually act.
Great. My family is fourth generation Lithuanian Americans, and I follow a lot of the Baltic issues, as you know, and disinformation that comes from Russia throughout Eastern Europe, but particularly the Baltic countries. So the Lithuanian government has created an initiative called debunk.eu to combat disinformation. They found that in this COVID crisis, there had been a significant increase in online disinformation with stories that have stirred up Russophobia in the Baltics, push false narratives and the failures of the Baltic governments, and spread messaging that COVID-19 is destroying the European Union. Are there any lessons the U.S. can learn from projects like Debunk EU?
So, Mr. Shimkus, I'm not familiar with that particular project, but clearly if that were to reveal information about websites that are engaged in misinformation, it would be great to have access to who is information to try and track them down, see the patterns that exist that cyber experts often try to do, and prevent that misinformation from spreading. Unfortunately, we don't have who is access because of an over-application of GDPR.
Yeah, and I'm trying to look for my clock to check my time. And if I have available time, if any one of the other panelists want to address that, that's combating information. I got 2 minutes left. Combating information with information is kind of what the Lithuanians are doing. And so it's, fighting that space. Does anybody else, maybe I see Ms. Collins Dexter shaking her head. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I think it's extremely important when we look at models around the globe that there are countries that are taking this very seriously, the issue of disinformation. We've seen how that's played out in Ukraine and some of the places that you've mentioned. This is part of the reason why I've advocated for a data protection agency. But in terms of looking around and seeing what are the lessons, how can we get this right? We have to have a vested interest in getting it right.
Thanks. Mr. Farid?
Thank you, Congressman. Good information, trustworthy information are necessary, but they're not sufficient conditions. So we need that information, but we also then need the platform algorithms to allow them to surface. If those get buried by the recommendation algorithms, they don't do us any good. So I think we need two things. We need that trustworthy information, and then we need for them to be valued and promoted above the untrusted information that we're talking about.
Great. I have 43 seconds left, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, and I'll yield back my time.
I thank the gentleman for yielding back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Butterfield for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you again for convening this very important hearing today, and thank you to the witnesses for your testimony. Mr. Overton, it's good to see you again. I've known you and of your work for many years now, and thank you very much for your testimony. Let me ask you, Mr. Overton, how does the dissemination of misinformation disenfranchise marginalized communities? Would you break it down at a level so that the average person can understand that?
Certainly. Thank you very much, and thanks for your leadership and your service to our country. The unique nature of social media involves micro-targeting, and as a result, especially with ads, you can target particular groups. So, for example, this is what the Russians did and some other folks do, targeting African Americans with particular messages, building trust, etc., and then toward the end saying, well, hey, let's protest police brutality and let's protest systemic racism by staying home and not voting. That is a real problem. And the micro-targeting, so other people in the nation don't really know what's going on, and these messages are targeted right at Black folks, that is a part of the problem. Now, micro-targeting has some good traits. If you think about sickle cell anemia, other things, we want to help people in certain ways, but it can also be used for negative purposes.
Well, it seems that we need to correct this issue and we need to move pretty fast. So what in your opinion, what are the platforms just plain failing to do, and what do we need to do immediately?
Well, the platforms were very serious in terms of COVID-19. They did things like look to outside experts and third-party credible entities to figure out what information was good, what information was bad. They invested a lot of resources and took it more seriously than they have taken voting issues. So the first thing is really platforms themselves need to step up to the plate. Second piece here is they need to disclose information so that we understand what's going on in terms of the American public, both the schemes that are going on and how they're applying their standards. So that disclosure at this point is important. You know, there's a question, can anything be done in terms of law in the next few months? But certainly a hearing, pressing these companies is important.
Let me next turn to Dr. Fareed. Dr. Fareed, how has the reluctance by some social media and tech companies to fact check content on their platforms actually exacerbated the spread of disinformation?
Thank you, Congressman. I think you're right. When Mark Zuckerberg takes the stand that we don't want to be the arbiters of truth, this is part of what the problem is we're facing in the misinformation apocalypse. But it's also, as I said in my testimony, completely missing the point. The point is not always entirely about what's true and what's false, but it's what's being amplified. The power of Facebook, the power of YouTube, the power of Twitter is in the recommendation engine. And as Professor Overton was saying, in the micro-targeting of information. So I think there's a bit of a head fake being done here to say, well, we don't want to tell people what's real and what's not, when in reality, they are telling us on a daily basis what is relevant and what we should view. So that is where I think the discussion should be had, is what is being actively promoted and recommended and micro-targeted. And then we can move away from some of the more difficult conversations of the gray area of content being either true or false.
Okay, and I think you may have touched on this, but let me just go ahead and put it out anyway. How would you recommend that tech companies take meaningful action to prevent the dissemination of this information on their platforms? Meaningful action. I mean, not just rhetoric, but they need to act quickly.
I agree. And I am deeply frustrated for over a decade in their response from everything from child sexual abuse to terrorism to illegal drugs and misinformation. And the reality is they have not acted. And so I think there should be a call of action to the advertisers. The reality is that the social media companies are almost entirely dependent on advertising dollars. There are 10 CEOs in the world who can wake up tomorrow and say, enough is enough. We are done with technology being weaponized. We will no longer advertise on these platforms. And there is a slowly growing effort on that part. A number of companies have started to withhold advertising dollars. Disney has done it in the past with YouTube because they failed to protect children. I think if we want action today, that's where the power is in the advertising dollars.
Thank you, Dr. Fareed. I've run out of time and our chairman yields a pretty mean gavel. I yield back.
I want to thank the gentleman for yielding back. Okay, I see the doctor is back in the house, so we will recognize Dr. Burgess.
Great, thank you, Chairman. I appreciate the recognition. Mr. Freed, let me ask you, I apologize for the fact that there are dueling hearings going on, and if you've already answered this, I'll apologize to you in advance. But in your written testimony, you argued that Congress should restore a duty of care by requiring the technology company to host content to only receive the 230 immunity if they make a good faith effort to remove said illicit content. So in your view, what does make up this good faith effort?
the good faith effort is not as much the issue there as the reasonable action, right? So under a common law field, any company can be held culpable if it acts negligently, recklessly, or knowingly failing to prevent one user of its services to harm other users. And so that actually creates the legal incentive to make sure that they're not online platforms take reasonable steps. Once they take reasonable steps, they're fine. But Section 230 says that no matter what happens, the platform cannot be held culpable, even if it's reckless and even knows about it has no legal incentive. If we actually required the reasonable step, I think this would largely solve itself. As Professor Freed mentioned, they'd have a legal incentive to act, and they will responsibility by design. They'll anticipate the risk, be more reasonable up front, and certainly when they know of illicit activity, they'll do more to stop it. So that requirement to take reasonable steps would mean their liability protection. That risk would encourage more responsible behavior.
Great. I had an opportunity just this week to have a conversation with our former colleague, Chris Cox, who was, I recall correctly, one of the authors of this provision originally. And he suggested that the authority by the state AGs to enforce unfair or deceptive trade practices, mini FTCs, I think he referred to them as, that they could be used to enforce content moderation policies as outlined in a terms and conditions. So, Mr. Freed, if you could speak to that.
So there is some concern that the state action would be preempted. So it's not quite clear what the states will be able to do. And I think that the state AGs have expressed concern about that. If something Congress wanted, it might want to clarify.
So given the cross-border applications and the internet and the way the technology works, where actually does the jurisdiction then reside?
Well, certainly if there's criminal activity in the state has jurisdiction. If citizens are being harmed, as you point out, there may be jurisdiction over the entity that's perpetrating the harm. If there are requirements that apply to the online providers, the online provider applies. So there are some jurisdictional issues to address, but we've done that before and we can do that again.
So is this a viable option to get companies to comply with their own content moderation policies?
I think so. It works for every other industry. It applies to every other industry, many of whom compete with the online platforms. There are non-online media entities, and the platforms are also competing with brick and mortar companies not in the media space. They don't have this obligation, and they deal with it. And so I'm not sure why the platforms shouldn't. Again, 230 works for the good Samaritans, but it's also shielding the bad Samaritans. We need to address the bad Samaritans. Eliminate 230, but fix it to right the incentives.
So seems like anything to change the applicability of Section 230 based on size of a technology company could create a barrier to entry for others who are just starting out and obviously much smaller. Is that a concern?
I actually don't think so, because under a duty of care, this is what's reasonable. And certainly the resources of the entity are a factor in what's reasonable. A smaller entity has fewer resources. A smaller entity has fewer users. A smaller entity has fewer users. So when they're smaller, there's a need for content moderation and less demand because they don't have the resources. That is, as they grow, the expectation grows with them, and you get responsibility for design. They build their platform when they're small to address the problems when they're big. The problem is they're retrofits. We have very, very large platforms that really weren't focused on this, right? And so now we have a much harder problem to solve. We want at the very beginning the startups to have the right, which I think a duty of care can do, and to suggest that there's a smaller platform versus larger one.
Gentleman's time is expired.
So I thank the chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you, gentleman yields back. Let me remind all members that in order to be recognized, your video needs to be on and active. So if you're in line waiting to be recognized, please make sure you have your video on. I see that the chairman of our full committee has returned from the Rules Committee. So it gives me great pleasure to recognize Mr. Pallone for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Doyle. And this is such an important hearing on disinformation and how it divides the nation. I constantly by Mark Zuckerberg that he doesn't want to be, and I quote, the arbiter of truth. But I think that that absolutely misses the point. And I know that Dr. Fareed is there, and in his written testimony, he talks about how certain disinformation or conspiracy theories are amplified on platforms like Facebook. And the problem caused by Facebook has nothing to do with truth and falsity, in my opinion. It's about what they amplify or don't. And it may go to a fundamental problem with Facebook's business model. So last month, the Wall Street Journal published an article entitled Facebook Executives Shut Down Efforts to Make the Site Less Divisive. And I'd like to introduce it for the record. It's here. And I think that this article shows that Facebook understands the problem but won't address it. I guess I should ask unanimous consent of you to enter it into the record, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. So let me ask Dr. Fareed, do you believe the major platforms understand that they are promoting disinformation and conspiratorial content, and could they address it if they wanted to?
Thank you, Congressman. So first of all, I think you're absolutely right about the landscape here. The Wall Street Journal did a very good job of revealing what we've known for a long time, which is that Mark Zuckerberg and the C-suite in Facebook knows that they are peddlers of hate, divisiveness, conspiracies because it's good for business. So they've known this for a long time. The algorithms have learned this to the tune of $70 billion last year in revenue, and they could do something about it. They absolutely could, but it would, of course, reduce engagement and therefore reduce profits. And so there's just, this is sort of our problem with these business models of social media, is that they're misaligned with individual societal and democratic goals, because they have figured out that they can tap into the lowest common denominator of humans. So it's like any other addictive substance, right? These things are tested in order to keep us addicted, in order to tap into the things that we are not necessarily positive for society. And so you can blame us, and you should blame the users for this, for falling into this trap. But the fact is that we are being manipulated by the algorithms in order for them to simply get our data and provide advertising dollars to us.
Well, thank you. So, I mean, these platforms may bias towards conspiracy theories, but I think the problem is made 10 times worse when important figures and government officials peddle disinformation or conspiracy and hate that feeds these platforms. So let me ask Ms. Collins-Dexter, in your written testimony, you discuss how some public figures peddle disinformation to the masses with few, if any, repercussions. And as we know, President Trump is one of those public figures. So let me ask you, how has President Trump used social media to spread or amplify disinformation that is harmful to Black Americans and otherwise inflame racial tensions? And you also mentioned that social media companies like Facebook are not fact-checking posts consistently, such as those related to mail-in voting. And so what is the effect of that inconsistent fact-checking? So first with the racial tensions, and second with the, mail-in voting as examples, if you could, Ms. Collins-Dexter.
Yes, thank you, Congressman. We've pointed out several different examples over the course of this in the ways in which commentary around protesters and this depiction of Black Lives Matter as a terrorist organization has had deep impacts in terms of harms to people on the ground. But another way in which I've seen the president push disinformation is actually some of his early commentary on COVID-19 and his push that lupus medication was actually what people should be using. Now, if you look again, disproportionately Black people are impacted by COVID, also disproportionately impacted by lupus and a number of other autoimmune diseases. It runs rampant in my family, for example. So that piece of disinformation allowed to stand that caused a run on lupus medication actually actively harmed people. My sister couldn't get her medication. There were a number of different issues. So that's just one example I would raise.
And what about the mail-in ballots and, comments about that?
again, this danger, like we've talked about the fact that vote by mail is very safe. There's research that shows that in elections, it has 0.0025% chance of fraud or something like that. So to promote that is a fraudulent practice, it has implications also for Black people going to polling places, which we know are being closed down, standing in long lines, not being able to engage in democracy safely.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you.
Chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee. Mr. Walden, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Doyle, and Chairman Pallone and I were both up at the Rules Committee, so I appreciate being worked in here, and I'm sorry I wasn't able to give my opening statement myself, but I understand Ms. Brooks did a wonderful job with it. So, Mr. Freed, I think many of the issues related to content moderation by platforms could be solved if companies enforce their terms of service in a transparent, uniform, and equitable pattern. That's what makes it so disconcerting in this case of Google that we've read about, that reportedly based action off inaccurate NBC reporting, and now just yesterday, another egregious action by Twitter to block the president's tweets. These recent actions make clear that the CEOs of these companies need to come before this committee to answer our questions. And if they will not come voluntarily, then Mr. Chairman, perhaps it's time we compel their attendance. Mr. Freed, free speech and content decisions are certainly tricky. And I'm certainly an advocate of the First Amendment. I have a degree in journalism. But how can we incentivize these companies to step up and apply their rules with more transparency and more uniformity?
Thank you, Mr. Walden. Good to see you. Certainly transparency would be helpful. I know there's some discussion that, a violation of a terms of service could be a contractual problem. There is some discussion, I think, of asking the FTC to step in and call it an unfair practice. So you could certainly try that. One thing I suggest you look at is, and this was raised by DOJ, is whether Section 230 might actually even preempt FTC action. There's an open question. If you look at the roommates.com case, which was mentioned sort of implicitly earlier, if the platform is itself acting in an illegal fashion and perhaps violating a term of service where that Congress's decision to make clear is an illegal action, an unfair practice, then maybe under the roommates case, the FTC could have jurisdiction because it's not a content moderation issue. I surmise, however, that the platforms will argue that no, this is about our content moderation, not about our terms of service, and so Section 230 preempts. So certainly calling it unfair practice to violate their terms of service could be an issue, but I'm not sure how that interplays with Section 230 just yet.
Yeah, and I guess for the average consumer user, pretty tough to take on these giants individually and wage this battle. This is bigger than City Hall.
And keep in mind, too, again, I'm all for the transparency, but they control their terms of service. So if they know that a violation of their terms of service could cause an FTC violation, they presumably would write their terms of service in a more generic way as to avoid liability under that sort of theory. So that's why I certainly think transparency helps. I fear we are going to have to address the 230 immunity to really solve this problem.
Well, I think it's long overdue in many respects. It was a law written decades ago in an era that didn't contemplate the modern communication technology, high scope and the power of these platforms. And I know it's not easy to quote unquote regulate speech, because what one person finds offensive, the other may say that's my right. And so they're in a tricky position as well. But I know we've asked Google 3 pretty simple questions about this case involving the Federalists, and just how were they notified? How did that work and all that? And we still don't have answers back on that. And they were actually pretty simple questions. Mr. Fareed, you mentioned how companies employ algorithmic amplification to increase views of certain content that draws attention to their platform, but need to prioritize algorithms to promote trusted information over misinformation. Should there be a heightened accountability for these platforms when it comes to amplified content in order to gain liability protection? And how do you incentivize these actions? And I know when I chaired the committee, we actually did a hearing on algorithms so members could better understand how they're created, because there's implicit bias in some of the algorithms that's unfair, and I'll leave it at that, but it was certainly demonstrated that there are some unfair issues in the algorithm. So Dr. Freed, can you explain?
Yeah, so there's no question, Congressman, that simply turning over everything to algorithms that are not explainable or understandable solves all of our problems. As Ms. Collins-Dexter pointed out, we have seen bias in algorithms in medical care and judicial systems. So we do have to be careful about that. And again, we've been beating this drum, but the transparency and the understanding of these algorithms is critical. I would say, though, that we still have this tension here between misalignment of corporate interests and societal interests and what is keeping people on the platform. And that, I think, is where that tension is. You're absolutely right, Congressman. They have a tough business to run. What insults you doesn't insult me, and vice versa.
I know my time's about over, but I would just say I've seen it too in the news business, where they actually track, read what story, what time of the day, which headline, which lead gets you most. And I'm not sure that's a good thing either. I realize they got to run their business, but I'm not sure that only reinforces it doesn't expand our scope of understanding and information. It may just drive us deeper into our own silos. And so I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes Ms. Matsui for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for your patience for some of us going back and forth all the time between rules and E&C. Facebook has announced that it will remove COVID-19 related misinformation that could contribute to imminent physical harm. However, Facebook appears to be adopted a narrow interpretation of imminent physical harm that is allowing significant amounts of disinformation to remain in circulation online. Dr. Freed, do you believe imminent physical harm should include false information about COVID-19 testing site locations, hours of operation, or documentation required?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I agree with you. I think Facebook has taken a particularly narrow definition of imminent harm. And maybe that was an excusable position 3-4 months ago, but I think it is inexcusable today when we know that even a fraction of the population that is getting misinformation can lead to health problems for the entire society and world. So I think that they need to take a much harder line on this, both in terms of what we see publicly and also the private groups that are much less transparent.
So do you also believe, is there additional public health misinformation you believe should be removed by Facebook?
Absolutely. We are seeing a proliferation of misinformation and conspiracies on Facebook, on YouTube, on Twitter, on Reddit, and on almost all social media platforms that are not actively being dealt with.
Well, even in situations where Facebook has taken down COVID-19 misinformation, has failed to adequately remove all posts spreading the same false information. In one instance, Facebook removed a post suggesting that wearing a mask in public can make you sick, but failed to remove duplicates or clones of this original post. Dr. Freed, in your opinion, has Facebook committed sufficient resources to identify and remove all duplicate or shared posts related to COVID-19 misinformation?
They have not. And part of that is excusable because most of their moderators have not been able to do the work from home, and I understand that. But the fact is that prior to COVID-19, they did not have the safeguards in place, both in terms of content moderators, in terms of technology, and in terms of policy to deal with these types of issues.
Okay. Facebook has promoted its groups features as a way for users to communicate privately with other users about the topic of shared interest. While these groups have allowed some family members or local clubs to foster more intimate interactions, they have also provided malicious actors with a new tool to spread misinformation, hate speech, and conspiracy theories. Ms. Collins-Dexter, how have white nationalists employed Facebook groups to spread hate speech, and have these groups translated into real-world activity?
Absolutely. Our first entry point into negotiating with Facebook actually came about 6 years ago when there were closed white nationalist hate groups that were doxing organizers and Black people in Sacramento and in Stone Mountain, Georgia. And people were showing up to those places and to people's homes with guns. And when we went to Facebook and asked them to make changes, they said they didn't feel like they had a problem and were slow to move. Now, cut to now, we see this plethora of issues coming out by the day of the ways in which violent hate speech, calls to murder, calls to violence run rampant in closed groups, and including targeting mosques and other places. and Facebook, again, has been slow to act.
Well, do you believe that Facebook provides sufficient public information about the ownership, management, and membership of neo-Confederate or white nationalist groups?
I think that's an interesting question. We are for sure in favor of privacy. That's why we support laws like the one in California. And I think it's extremely important that we maintain data protection activities. But again, when that line crosses over to bullets dipped in pig's blood, like calls to action that are actively going to compromise people's lives and safety, we have to really be strident about the ways in which we're making that information public so people can protect themselves.
Okay, I just have a few seconds here. YouTube has had some success limiting the prevalence of misinformation by adjusting its recommendation algorithms. Dr. Fareed, do you believe YouTube has the capacity to further adjust its algorithms to limit the spread of misinformation? And if so, why haven't these adjustments been implemented? I've got like 17 seconds. You have 17 seconds.
So the answer is yes, they have the ability. In late 2018, we saw upwards of 10% of the recommended videos being conspiratorial, and under public pressure, they've been able to reduce that to around 3%. They've always had the ability to do it. They simply have not.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And I thank all the witnesses, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Its chair now recognizes Mr. Kinzinger for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all our witnesses for being here. Very much appreciated. Despite all the debate, I actually have yet to really take a position on whether to preserve, amend, or repeal Section 230. Given the potential ramifications, I definitely want to just take my time and be thoughtful. What makes the most sense is to make other legislative or regulatory attempts to bring about the change we want before we throw the baby out with the bathwater. If those options fail, we still have the ability to go back and amend or repeal it later. For example, I've introduced solutions to one subset of these issues, the fake accounts, which are under discussion today. One of them is HR 6586, the Social Media Accountability and Account Verification Act, which was referred to this committee. And I also have a second bill, it's HR 6587, the Social Media Fraud Mitigation Act, which is related, but was referred to the Judiciary Committee. Taken together, the bills seek to protect consumers by improving the operations of social media companies and punishing those who use fake accounts to cause harm to others. My office took on the task of trying to legislate or regulate social media companies without amending Section 230 or trampling on free speech, and it was certainly not easy. We consulted with attorneys, nonprofits, consumer advocates, industry, and more. And yes, we went to every, or almost nearly every Democrat on the two subcommittees represented here today to ask them to work with me on the bill and lead it with me. We offered to work with anyone to improve our language to try to garner broad support. To be fair, some did engage and provide constructive feedback, and I'm proud to say that much of the feedback was incorporated into the bill. I'm not saying this to be mean-spirited. I'm not calling anyone out by name, but as of today, and not for the lack of effort, I still don't have a partner on the other side of the aisle to work with me on it. If my friends on the other side of the aisle don't like my bill or other ideas offered by my Republican colleagues, that's fine. It won't hurt my feelings, but we've put something out there. And so let's either work on this together or please put forward a reasonable solution of your own. Because frankly, I'm a little frustrated that we keep having the Section 230 conversation and we haven't found a path forward, or rather, it seems we can't even find an intersection where we're supposed to meet to chart a path forward. So I'll end my comments by once again inviting my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, or really any of my colleagues, I could use some Republican support as well, to reach out so we can move this ball forward. But more broadly, whether we're talking about romance scams, fake profiles, or tools of statecraft involved in massive coordinated disinformation effort, we clearly have a problem with the status quo. We've already touched on whether you all think that social media companies are utilizing all their tools that they can to be able to take down scams or fraudulent activity. And Mr. Walden touched on the incentives for the companies. So I want to follow up on that with Mr. Fareed. Putting aside the complexities of algorithm development, what other barriers are there in preventing the companies from implementing these safeguards?
I think the primary barriers are technology. We saw that when the platforms wanted to remove adult pornography or copyright information, they were able to do that. So it is primarily one of resources being put to research to deal with these issues. But there is real tension here, and we have to recognize it, which is that it is fighting up against the core business model. You're literally asking companies to reduce their profits. And look, that's a tough ask. And that's because the core business model is one of engagement and not one of the way, say, Netflix or Spotify or Amazon Prime is, where I pay a monthly fee and they get the money no matter what, and they just have to grow the user base. So there's tension here. And I think that tension is at the core of why it is difficult to get the companies to act on these issues.
So is the only real answer then government intervention in your mind?
I think there's two interventions. One is healthy competition. Maybe it's time for better business models. Maybe we don't have to have a purely data-driven, ad-driven technology sector. Maybe there's a better business model. Maybe advertisers can say, you know what, we don't want our ads running against hateful, divisive, conspiratorial content. And then, of course, there's us, the user. I mean, so you could blame the people creating the fake content. You can blame the platform for amplifying it, but we're part of the problem too. We're the ones sharing it, liking it, and retweeting it. So as an educator, I also have to say this is our failure, that we, the people, are part of the problem as well. And of course, there has to be sensible regulation. And I agree with you, Congressman, that you don't want to throw out 230 and you don't want to move too fast in this space and have unintended consequences. There's been many, many wonderful things from technology, and we have to think carefully and thoughtfully how modest change can help us get out of the mess that we're in today.
Well, thank you. And I have another question now.
I see the gentleman's time has expired. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Kinzinger. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Castor. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hey, our witnesses have been terrific today, so thank you very much, all of you. I'd like to ask if the liability shield under Section 230 were eliminated today, what practical changes would the tech platforms like Facebook make? What would we see happen? I'll start with Ms. Collins-Dexter.
Sorry, could you say that one more time?
If the liability shield under Section 230 were eliminated today, what practical changes would we see tech platforms like Facebook make?
Yeah, you know, I honestly don't know. And this is part of the reason why I think we need to have this conversation in a broader context. One, about general corporate responsibility and corporate concentration. Two, around like understanding what the research is telling us about 230. I know that it's time to have a serious conversation around 230 for sure. But in terms of like privacy protections and a number of other factors, you know, blowtorch to 230 before we've actually had a chance to talk about that is important. And I know Overton is.
Yeah, let me just
Mr.
chime
Overton?
in. Sure,
Yeah.
let me just chime in for a moment. We really do need 230, and we need some form of 230 for a couple reasons. One, we want Black Lives Matter, we want the Tea Party, we want a variety of grassroots organizations to be able to participate and post their material without fear that the platforms feel like they're going to be sued, right? So 230 is important in terms of facilitating the speech of grassroots folks. It's an important provision, right? But like we said, there's some problems and there need to be some tweaks here. It's also important in terms of the original purpose was to facilitate content moderation. This notion that you're not responsible for every single thing that goes up. And again, as a result, you can have a lot of different voices up. But again, if you are discriminating and using your algorithms to make money, to target employment ads toward whites and away from Latinos, that needs to be a problem.
It's worse than that, though, with the proliferation of child pornography and other illicit behavior. It goes beyond just the debate under free speech and the First Amendment. There's a lot of illicit activity that these tech platforms that use that liability shield to shield themselves.
That's absolutely right. And that's why I say, hey, we should think about reform rather than just, I think your initial point was, let's just kind of blow it up or what would happen if we repealed it completely, right? And I do think that there's a problem with just absolute complete repeal, not just to the tech companies, but to average citizens in our democracy.
And I agree. Yeah, I agree. But there's some good news here, which is the benefits of 230 come from C2. It comes from the safe harbor for content moderation, right? We didn't want Prodigy to be punished for stopping child predators. We didn't want Prodigy punished when it tried and missed something. So we can keep C2. The problem is C1, which says you don't have to do any of that. So my proposal is let's put that duty of care back in place. Let's keep C2, which keeps the internets and the platforms as an avenue for free expression. But let's tweak C1 so that they actually have to earn that. They actually have to exercise a duty of care to stop the illicit stuff. In exchange for that, that gets us the best of both worlds. We stop the illegal activity, but we keep the platform for free expression.
And Mr. Freed?
Thank you. We have an interesting experiment that has been being played out in Germany over the last few years with the NetzDG law, which was addressing hate speech, terrorism, and extremism. And what happened is when the Germans passed very strict laws on takedown, what happened is that the companies ramped up their human moderators. And they ended up sort of doing a good job. They just said, look, now the law mandates this with penalties up to 50 million euros for each failure. And guess what? They ramped up. They started getting better moderators, better technology, and the law actually worked. So we have a good existence proof that we can actually do better.
Thanks to all of you. I'll yield back. Thanks.
Thank you. Gentlelady yields back. It now gives me pleasure to introduce my friend and fellow suffering Pittsburgh Pirate fan, Mr. Bilirakis, for 5 minutes.
We haven't lost the game yet, Mr. Chairman.
That's because we haven't played yet.
Yeah, you're right. We have a good shot with this short season, though. Okay, we'll get back to business. I want to thank the witnesses. Mr. Freed, as both Representative McKinley and I have passionately called on in past hearings, we have seen advertisements for the sale of illegal drugs on social media websites. As we know, there are two types of ad groups online. One, a private negotiation between the platform and the advisor. The other, where the advisor is the winner of a bid war for immediate available ad space, where the platform is less connected to the transaction. And this is a question: how, if at all, can Section 230 be retrofitted to fairly provide platform accountability for advertisements of illegal products in both these circumstances, or is there another method to address this very serious problem?
Yeah, and I think,
Mr. Freed.
Sure, thank you, Congressman. I think if we fix 230C1 and recreate the duty of care, we will make a lot of progress, right? Because then there actually is an incentive to solve the problem. There's a legal consequence for failing to. If a nightclub doesn't do enough to stop the peddling of drugs in its nightclub, it can be culpable. But in the same scenario, a platform cannot because of C1. So I think we need to recreate that duty of care. And this applies to all the horribles that we see on the internet, whether it's illicit drugs, peddling of child pornography, cybercrime, fraud. There is a lack of a legal incentive that applies to everybody else who's not an online platform, whether they're traditional media or even just brick and mortar retail. And we need to write those incentives. We can save C2 so we get the free expression. But if we recreate that duty of care just to require reasonable action and let there be scrutiny. Right now, we don't have to take the word of everybody else, but we have to take the word of the platforms. They may be doing a good job. In fact, often they are, but there's no scrutiny of that. And that's why we need to fix the incentive.
Thank you. Next question, again for Mr. Freed. Section 230C2, as you mentioned in your written testimony and then also here, states that a provider is protected from liability for any action voluntarily taken in good faith to restrict access to or availability of material that the provider or user considers to be obscene or otherwise objectionable. And that's a quote here. That is an exceptionally wide protection. What is your opinion? In your opinion, what would be required for a provider to fail that standard under the current language? And are you aware of any real world solutions where the standard was not met? Again, for Mr. Freed.
Sorry, I'm having a little mic trouble. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
So when we're talking about speech, we do have to be a little more concerned, as Mr. Walden pointed out about the First Amendment. But there may be some value in the good faith provision, right? So if it's clear, right, Section 230 is meant to protect consumers, right? So an effort to protect consumers done in good faith is fine. But if there's evidence, and it would take evidence, but if there is evidence that there's a pretextual use of content moderation, it's not really to help consumers, but that's being used as a pretext for some other motive, then you might have a court say, well, okay, 230 doesn't apply. There are starting to be some discussion of that. It's not always a clear discussion of good faith, but I'd look for a discussion of that. What is pretextual rather than protecting consumers? That may be a place to explore. That way you don't worry about regulating speech, but if it's clear that there is evidence that's not what they're doing is protecting consumers, then maybe they don't get the defense of 230. Now, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily culpable for anything. It just means they've lost their liability shield. They still would have had to have engaged in something illicit, but at least you can have that conversation. Have they done something? Have they violated a contract? Have they violated a law without using 230 as a shield when they're not really protecting a consumer?
All right, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back my 35 seconds. Appreciate it very much. Thank the witnesses as well.
I thank the gentleman. It gives me now pleasure to introduce the gentleman from the great state of California, Mr. McNerney, for 5 minutes.
I think the chairs and the ranking members and the panelists, this is a great hearing and great engagements on both sides of the aisle, so thank you all. Last year, I sent a letter to Mr. Zuckerberg expressing concerns about the potential conflict of interest that Facebook faces between their bottom line and addressing the spread of political disinformation on their platform. I asked specific questions focusing on Facebook's handling of disinformation, but they did not answer my questions. I also asked Facebook some of these questions again when they testified before the committee earlier this year. Still, they refused to answer my questions. Professor Fareed, you spent a lot of time looking into these issues and working with communities to understand, with the companies to understand their practices. What is it that they are hiding?
Mark Zuckerberg is hiding the fact that he knows that hate, lies, and divisiveness are good for business. He's hiding the fact that content moderation is bad for business, and so he props up these phony arguments to hide behind. And I think Mark Zuckerberg is hiding the fact that his entire business model of maximizing engagement to maximize advertising dollars just stinks. It's bad for us as individuals, it's bad for society, it's bad for democracy, but it's awfully good for his bottom line to the tune of $70 billion last year. I continue to argue that the core business model is the poison here. When you are in the attention-grabbing, ad-driven business, your job is to keep people on the platform for as long as possible. And we know that hate, divisiveness, outrageous and conspiratorial drives business. And he knows this, and he is profiting off of the back of us as individuals, society, and democracies. And I think we should hold him accountable for that.
Well, thank you. That was a pretty strong statement, Professor. I appreciate it. Spencer Overton, thank you for presenting this morning. Some Republicans in Washington have made demonstrably false allegations of anti-conservative bias on social media. But as the representative from Stockton, California, the most racially diverse city in the country, my concern is really about protecting the rights of all citizens to vote. Professor, can you talk about some of the tactics that have been used to suppress votes of Black people and people of color on social media platforms? Also, with just 131 days to go before the general election, what tactics are you concerned about that will be used leading up to the November election?
Yes, thank you very much. And just to be clear, I don't think that we can equate content moderation, which is debatable, right, with voter suppression. I think that they're just very different things. So to kind of have some false neutrality like they're the same thing is wrong. This targeting of messages at particular communities is a primary device. So we see that. We saw that in 2016. We're seeing it in 2020. Certainly, messages about extensive fraud can certainly discourage people from participating and engaging, or messages that hey, we're going to have law enforcement at every polling place. A variety of messages like that can certainly discourage participation, especially when they're targeted at particular communities.
Well, thank you. Professor Fareed has already addressed the question of what action the platforms could be taking and talked about the need for advertisers to act. I'd like to hear from the other witnesses, starting with Ms. Collins-Dexter. What are some of the steps that social media platforms could be taking right now that they aren't taking to combat the spread of disinformation on their platforms?
Thank you. So I think there's a lot to be said around the recommendations that folks have mentioned. Often when you're recommending other sources, it can take you down a dark rabbit hole. And we've seen that a couple of times with increased recommendations of white supremacists. I think there needs to be stuff fixed around the content moderation. I think we need permanent civil rights infrastructure that exists in the executive level in the C-suite working with Mark Zuckerberg. I think it's critically important that we see civil rights not as a partisan issue, but one that has implications across the board and that there's someone there that represents those interests.
Well, thank you, Professor Overton, in 30 and 17 seconds.
Yes, civil rights, it's not partisan, it's a bipartisan issue. Facebook has kind of created this false dichotomy of like conservatives versus civil rights. That's completely wrong. People in both parties are committed to civil rights, and we need to stay firm with that.
Thank you. I ran out of time, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. I thank the gentleman. I see my good friend, Mr. Johnson, appears to be in an automobile, hopefully in the passenger seat. So, Bill, you're recognized for 5 minutes, and keep your eyes on the road if you're not in that passenger seat.
Hey, I'm an IT guy, Mr. Chairman, and I can multitask. So I'm
okay.
Good. But I am in the passenger seat. Thank you very much. Hey, it frustrates me when I hear these tech companies like Facebook and Google and Twitter and others hide behind the excuse that it's their algorithms that are making these decisions about the content that they serve up to the American people. Look, I've got 2 degrees in computer science. We've talked about this before in other hearings. Algorithms are logic constructs that are built by humans, and the computers are told what to do. They don't dream this stuff up on their own. And I also get frustrated because, one of the main reasons that these technology platforms have been able to be as prolific and as powerful as they are is because they haven't been regulated. And in the absence of regulation, it takes the notion of social responsibility even that much higher, to self-police. So, Mr. Freed, in your testimony, you talk about how the tech industry is one of the only sectors that not only is free from regulation before the fact, but they're also free from judicial scrutiny after the fact. Instead, Congress has delegated the oversight authority to these tech companies, to the actual tech companies themselves to self-regulate. How has this balance been struck in other related industries like the newspaper or broadcast industries? And what has been the effect of that balance?
Yeah, ordinarily it's one or the other. If you're regulated, ordinarily you might have some limited immunity for the regulated activity because your business model has been restricted. If you're not regulated, then ordinarily you are held culpable if you make a bad decision in designing your business model. The platforms have the best of both worlds. Now, the traditional media, right, still have a duty of care. In the New York Times versus Sullivan case, for example, right, the Supreme Court very importantly said there are First Amendment protections in holding a media defendant liable when there's a public official who's bringing a libel suit. But even in that case, they are subject to a knowledge or reckless disregard standard. So if they don't do their due diligence and are reckless or have knowledge of falsity, they can still be held culpable under a standard of care. They put a lot of effort into their fact checking to avoid that sort of culpability. And of course, if it's not a public figure, there's even more potential culpability because it's not that high of a standard. But in a case where a platform knowingly or is recklessly disregarding falsity, they still can't be held culpable. And that gives them an advantage because they can avoid the ordinary costs of business in avoiding harm.
Well, I think I've lost my sound. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back the remainder of my time. I apologize. I don't know why, but I can't.
You know what? We can hear you, Mr. We can hear you, Mr. Johnson. You still have 1 minute and 25 seconds.
Okay. Well, here goes my last question then. You know, and I appreciate what Mr. Freed just said. We've seen instances where beyond the platforms for third-party information distribution to instead acting as content providers. And I agree with Mr. Freed. You can't be both. So, Mr. Freed, as edge platforms make this move from neutral bulletin boards of the 1990s to play content, has Section 230 given these platforms a leg up, an advantage among their media industry competitors?
I think so. They don't have to be as sensitive to misinformation, to defamation. They avoid costs that every other responsible media organization has to be very concerned about, right? They're pushing data. They're not worried as much about curating content. And that gives them an advantage.
Yeah, I agree with you totally. Mr. Chairman, in spite of my technical malfunction, I'll yield back a total of 15 seconds. Thank you.
Okay, I thank the gentleman. Now it gives me pleasure to introduce Vermont's most popular congressman, Peter Welsh. Mr. Welsh, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to start out with a reference to two of my colleagues, Mr. Kinzinger and Mr. Johnson, and what he just said. Mr. Kinzinger asked the question as to whether it is time to pull the plug and to say that Congress has to act on Section 230. And that would be Congress making decisions about what a duty of care is, making a decision whether to provide regulatory authority to oversee that. My view is ask the witnesses what they believe is established standards, or can we continue to leave that to the policing of the various platforms? Ms. Collins Dexter, just very briefly.
Yeah, if I understand you, I think you're saying more whether or not we should do regulation. Sorry, you cut out.
Law and regulation.
Yes, we absolutely need it. I think it's important.
Okay, I just want to go through this really quickly. So, and Mr. Fareed.
Absolutely. We've been waiting for years, Congressman, for the tech industry to self-regulate, and they haven't. So we have to make some changes.
Okay. And Mr. Freed?
Don't eliminate 230, but fix it.
Okay. And Professor Overton?
Yes, we need some changes.
And I'm going to characterize something that I think is what I'm seeing, the situation. You have a case like the typical defense from the tech companies about interfering, as they put it, with Section 230 is that 230 they cite, and this committee years ago was the author of Section 230, has made us the biggest internet success in the world. Now, Mr. Zuckerberg's argument is essentially, it's just, look how rich I am. That's how successful Section 230 is. But the casualty more and more is democratic discussion and democratic debate. And this is where I want to go to Mr. Johnson. The Zuckerberg defense is that he doesn't want to monitor speech. But as a number of you have said, and Mr. Johnson pointed out, the algorithm is something they control, number one. And number two, as Professor Overton pointed out, it's not about speech. It's about peddling the conflicting content that will get the most hits and produce the most money. Can each of you comment as to whether you see that as an ongoing threat to our democratic debate and dialogue? And I'll start
I'll start with you, Mr. Freed.
Was that Freed or Fareed? If it was Freed, I would say fix the incentives and the rest will fix it.
Pardon me?
I'd say fix the incentives and the rest will fix itself. We don't need to regulate them. We just need to give them the same incentive everybody else has to moderate their content, protect consumers, and know that if they're reckless, they're going to be culpable.
All right. Mr. Fareed.
You're absolutely right, Congressman. They control the algorithms. They have designed the algorithms to promote the hate and the divisive and the conspiratorial, and they can optimize it differently. They just need the right incentives, whether that's regulatory, advertising, or competition.
And let me go into Professor Overton. The question I think many of us have, and my colleague John Sarbanes has raised this before, can Section 230 freedom for these platforms to do anything they want, where the algorithm is about intensifying division, coexist with decent democratic debate? Or does one have to become the casualty of the other?
Well, so far one has become the casualty of the other. And part of the problem here is that the platforms have not taken the steps they need to protect civil rights. They have the authority, they have the power, they haven't used it effectively. They haven't responded here. So that is the problem. And in light of that, I do believe that the status quo is untenable.
All right. I thank you very much for this excellent hearing, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank the gentleman for yielding back. Let's see now who's next. Chair recognizes Mr. Flores for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for hosting this hearing. Mr. Freed, thank you for appearing here today and for your thoughtful testimony. In particular, I appreciate your sensitivity to preserving First Amendment rights in the context of suggesting practical and effective solutions to the spread of disinformation. As you succinctly observed earlier, Section 230 was created to, quote, one, help a nascent online industry to develop into a forum for user-generated content, and two, to stem the growing spate of harmful behavior on the internet, unquote. I think we can all agree it succeeded beyond all expectations on the first go to grow the industry, but has fallen woefully short of stemming harmful behavior for the second part. You've recommended recalibrating Section 230 to restore a duty of care by requiring internet platforms to take reasonable, good faith steps to prevent illicit use of their services as a condition of receiving Section 230's protection. In other words, holding the platforms accountable when they act with negligent, reckless, or willful disregard. Can you elaborate on what restoring a duty of care looks like in practice and how that becomes operational? In other words, what is the dynamic that makes this approach successful?
So it's all about incentives. I think a number of the witnesses have talked about it. Every other non-platform has a duty, right? If they let their facilities be used to harm another and don't take reasonable steps, they can be held accountable. That's really what we want. No one can question them right now when they say we've done enough, we're being reasonable. And again, in many cases they may be, and they'll be vindicated when they are. But when they're not, and you can't question it, victims are left with no remedy. Often they can't even get discovery, because as soon as the court says, oh, sorry, it's a content moderation issue, you can't even question whether the platforms are being responsible. Are they being reckless? Are they in willful disregard of a lot of awful stuff happening on their platform? If you create that duty of care, you solve that problem, but you keep the great stuff that has made the platforms so big. It's the content moderation safe harbor to promote free expression. That's the good part. That's what I think everyone wanted to do. That's what Congress wanted to do to address the Prodigy case, to help the good actor, the good Samaritan. Unfortunately, C1 protects the bad Samaritan.
Let's dig a little bit further into this. How do we determine what constitutes a reasonable, good faith steps to prevent illicit use? And can you provide an example of a model to illustrate? That would be very helpful.
Sure. The reasonableness is not hard. That's the standard everybody lives on if you're not a platform, right? So if you're acting negligently or recklessly, you can be held accountable. We don't really have to define that. There's plenty of precedent on that. The faith is a little more of a challenge. But again, I think the key there, and again, we have to be careful because the good faith provision tends to come up more in a speech context than a illicit activity context. But are they really trying to moderate to protect consumers, or is it a pretext? Are they using the claim of content moderation not to protect consumers to accomplish some other objective? If there is evidence of that, then you can actually say, okay, let's strip away the protection of 230 because this is not about protecting consumers. This is not being done in good faith. Then you have to ask the second question, which is, have they really done something illicit? They may not have. If it's a pure speech issue, even if they don't get protection of 230, the First Amendment will protect them. It's, have they violated some other duty? Once you get rid of the 230 protection, then you can ask that question. Many times they won't have violated a duty. Unfortunately, there are cases where I think they are violating that duty. That's the incentive we need to fix.
Okay. By the way, it's great to have you join us with the committee again today, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Flores. He yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Cardenas, for 5 minutes. You need to unmute, Tony.
Got it. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate this opportunity and ranking member, chairman and ranking members and women to have this important hearing. The issues that come to mind to me for Americans is that we have a lot of major problems going on today, and Americans don't know who to believe or where to get their information and what to believe. So people are confused about what's news and what's commentary. The leaders of this nation have had an inherent level of credibility in the hearts and minds of Americans for generations, and that's a good thing. We have a big problem when we have a president who is misusing his access to the loudest megaphones in the land. And by virtue of the megaphone and his affinity for making false claims, in the biggest transmitter of misinformation and disinformation he's become. According to one database, as of April 3rd, 2020, President Trump has made 18,000 false or misleading claims during his time in office. Even if they only have that half right, you're still approaching 10,000 times of the most powerful person in the world giving misleading or misinformation. We all know a few of the most recent claims: the use of hydroxychloroquine to cure the coronavirus, which the FDA has now said not to use because the medicine has failed in several clinical trials. Or the constant rhetoric of the Hispanic invasion. He has used this word at least 24 times when referring to Latinos and Latina immigrants or asylum seekers. Even after a shooter killed 20 people in El Paso last fall and referenced the Hispanic invasion, Trump warned yet again of a looming invasion and claimed without any evidence whatsoever that a caravan of migrants headed to the border had been infiltrated by gang members. He even sent U.S. troops to the border, insisting that the operation was necessary to keep our country safe. But after the election was over, there wasn't another peep about an invasion, and our troops were quietly called back. When the public reacts in horror to what he tweets, sometimes he and his staff walk things back and say he was just kidding. Well, of course, the American people are confused. More than just confusing disinformation and misinformation are harmful to the things that are harmful to the people of this great nation when they come from a supposed leader and can have even more dangerous consequences for marginalized communities. Ms. Collins-Dexter, in your testimony, you mentioned disinformation campaigns that have used social media to inflame racial divisions and hostilities in America. And we all know the president loves to use inflammatory rhetoric, however inaccurate, to sow hate and discord between Americans. Can you explain the long-term and short-term consequences and impacts of disinformation and misinformation that come from the president on disenfranchised and underrepresented populations?
Thank you, Congressman. There's a number of different issues here. There's one, the safety of people offline. We've seen an increase of white nationalist hate crimes carried out against different groups, Latinx, Asian, Black communities, Muslim communities. And part of that stems from what we're seeing in closed groups. Also, voter suppression, as Dr. Overton has talked about. We've seen a lot of that. We've talked extensively about Black attacks. It's actually been woefully underreported how much disinformation around voting has been targeted to Latinx communities and actually was targeted through the Russian troll farms. And so there's a number of ways in which we see fractures in our democracy and ability to live that come from disinformation online being unregulated by figures, particularly those that are validated with blue checks by their name.
Thank you. And to some of our panelists, if you could explain Section 230, being that some of these platforms are now the largest corporations in America, apparently having revenues in the tune of tens of billions of dollars a year. Are they adhering to 230 correctly when it comes to the possibility of interfering with their revenue? In other words, do they have enough resources to be more technology adherent and also hire more individuals so that they can actually do their due diligence and adhere to the spirit of 230 while still giving themselves the opportunity to continue their business model? Okay, no panelists have an opinion about whether or not it's a shortage of resources for companies like Facebook and others. Okay. All right. Well,
I'm in, Congressman. I don't think it's a shortage of resources. When Facebook makes $70 billion a year, this is not a resource problem. This is a priority problem.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Okay, thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you. Chair now recognizes Ms. Brooks for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much for this incredibly important hearing. I want to talk about the practical aspects. When we had Mark Zuckerberg testify before our committee now a couple of years ago, I actually asked him the question about promulgation of terrorist messaging. I had a constituent who actually had been beheaded by ISIS. I'm a former U.S. attorney and prosecuted many child exploitation cases and talked about still the proliferation of child exploitation over the internet. And he talked about the number of content moderators that the company had hired, and they were hiring more. Dr. Fareed, I'd like you to talk a little bit about the practical aspects of how content moderators work. And I believe Dr. Collins Dexter, you might have mentioned that content moderators are often not in this country. I was not aware of this. Can both of you quickly talk about how the platforms actually use content moderators? And then also, I've recently heard that they sued these platforms because of really horrific kind of the type of work that they do.
Yeah.
So I'm very concerned about this.
I think you're right to be concerned, Congresswoman. So first of all, most of the moderators, the vast majority, are not employees of Facebook. They are third party. They go through vendors. There have been horrific stories of their misuse. They're underpaid. They're overworked. They have PTSD within weeks of working because they are looking at the absolute worst and horrific content that you can't even imagine online, and they are not given the mental health issues or the resources to deal with it. Facebook has outsourced some of the ugliest work that they have to do, and I think that they should be ashamed of themselves for that. The fact is they don't have enough moderators. They're very happy to trot out the number of moderators, but the reality is these moderators are spending fractions of a second looking at a piece of content and having to look at that for 8-10 hours straight, day after day after day. These are horrific working conditions, and that's why some of the really good investigative journalists have called out these companies for horrific treatment of this. I can tell you, having worked in the child sexual exploitation space, that when the National Center for Missing Exploited Children or the Canadian Center for Child Protection does content moderation, they greatly limit to only a few hours a day what moderators will see. They have mental health issues, they have breaks, they take care of the people who are doing the dirty, ugly work, and Facebook is simply not doing that.
Thank you. And I must say that because I was a prosecutor in these types of cases, I did witness some of this, and it is horrific. And so thank you for your time. But what we have to have content moderators, and is your suggestion that through either more reporting, more transparency, that the country, the world understand what is being allowed on these platforms?
What we should be moving to, first of all, is not doubling, but quadrupling 10-factor moderators so they can spend less and less time looking at this material to sort of minimize the harm. And at the same time, we should be deploying technology to mitigate the content that human moderators have to look at. The goal should be, you're always going to need human moderators to make the difficult calls, but technology can do better and better at this. We've seen that successful in the child sexual exploitation space, but it's simply, again, an issue of investment. So we need way more moderators than we have. We have to treat them better. They have to have mental health issues, and we need to start deploying technology in a much more effective way to minimize the harm to the human moderators.
Thank you. I'm going to shift very briefly. Dr. Collins-Dexter, you mentioned in your opening statement about the Office of Congress's OTA. I'm on the bipartisan committee on modernization of Congress, and we have talked about renewing Congress's, in the House, the Office of Technology Assessment, I believe, or can you talk about what role you believe that would play, or you think in order to help us move forward in these very difficult understanding of this type of problem? What was your recommendation there?
Yeah, so I mean, two more things on content moderation. When we first went to Facebook 5 years ago and told them about the hate speech and violent threats online, they told us that their content moderators didn't understand how racism looked in the US, and that's why there were false positives. So that's an issue. Also, they've cut back a lot, which in a time of coronavirus is a big deal. Shout out to my mother-in-law who worked at the Library of Congress and was a part of this. And she did a lot of like bipartisan research around technology. And one of the things they said is that when they took the partisanship out of the research, they were actually able to do a lot and invest in like innovation in communities.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Chair now recognizes Congresswoman Kelly for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all that are testifying today. As we've established, many people, especially young people, use social media as their primary source of obtaining news. And also, as we've established, unfortunately, through COVID and recent protests, there's been a lot of misinformation and disinformation. Ms. Collins-Dexter and Mr. Overton, social media platforms have used a variety of approaches to reduce misinformation on their platforms, removing or down ranking misinformation that doesn't pass fact checking by independent organizations, up-ranking and featuring authoritative content from recognized health authorities, changing their user experience designed to introduce friction, and being more transparent about the use of machine learning to moderate content. Should they be using these approaches on other topics that create similar harms, such as the census, political protests, or voting? And what other approaches should they be using now? Either one of you can start.
Professor Overton, do you want to start?
Sure, thanks so much. Certainly, when we look at, I know that they have fallen short in some ways with COVID here, and Dr. Fareed, I defer to him, but I would also just say they have been doing a better job with COVID-19 than they have with regard to voting rights. So I would agree with you that they need to, they do a good job on obscenity. They could do a good job on some other areas. They need to adopt some of these practices. Some of it is technology and investing in technology. Some of it is changing definitions about what needs to be moderated in terms of voter suppression, in terms of misrepresentations about long lines, et cetera. That stuff needs to be included as well from a policy standpoint.
Yeah, I agree. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go on.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think we have been asking them for years to make certain changes, and it is mind-boggling how quickly they were able to scale up in a couple weeks into when disinformation was exploding online. Now, unfortunately, it was a little bit late because there was a lot of Black disinformation that we've been tracking. I'll be releasing a report later this week around how much had traveled before they cracked down. But I think what we see time and time again is that the urgency that they feel around other issues does not apply when we're talking about white nationalism or things anti-Black disinformation.
Thank you. Professor Fareed, in your testimony, you mentioned how video recommendation algorithms can accelerate disinformation and create a feedback loop. What incentive is there for social media companies to stop their current practices if it's generating more eyeballs and more ad revenue? And how should companies intervene? And is there a specific approach you believe platforms should take for viral content review?
Good. So the first thing to understand is that on YouTube, for example, 70%, 70, of watched videos are those that are recommended by YouTube, not just organically you clicking on a video. So they are controlling what we see to a significant extent, number one. Number two, when, for example, YouTube was called out over and over again for not protecting children online, Disney withheld advertising dollars, and then YouTube made changes. Similarly, when they started getting called out for horrific, dangerous, and deadly conspiracies, they eventually made changes. So there are real hard technological problems here. There are difficult content moderation problems, but we have not even come close to that line yet. The issue is, as we've been talking about, is just a misalignment of incentives. So they profit with eyeballs. Conspiratorial, hateful, and divisiveness maximizes eyeballs. So unless there is a regulatory oversight, an advertising boycott, or better platforms emerge, their incentives are not there. And so we have to sort of give them those incentives.
Okay. And then how should companies intervene? And is there a specific approach you believe platforms should take for viral content review?
Absolutely. So when content, and you're starting to see this, goes viral, there needs to be human or algorithmic moderation. If something has 2 views, I'm not worried about it right now, but when those things spike, and they know when they spike because the recommendation algorithms find them and start promoting them, they have to have extra scrutiny. And that just means putting the resources to that.
Thank you so much.
Let me just emphasize one more thing too, Pierre. You have to understand that on social media, the half-life of a post is measured in hours. So this is not something you can come to a week later or a month later. You have literally minutes to deal with these things as they go viral because they happen very, very fast.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you to all the witnesses, and I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Hudson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Doyle, Ranking Member Latta, Chairwoman Schakowsky, and Ranking Member McMorris-Rodgers. Thank you for holding this joint hearing today. And thank you to all our witnesses for what's been an excellent discussion. The United States is a country founded on the principle of free speech and the free exchange of ideas. This is one of the principles that truly makes our nation great. However, I'm disturbed by a recent trend of political censorship and liberal bias that has consumed social media platforms. Just yesterday, as been mentioned earlier, Twitter took it upon themselves to censor another one of President Trump's tweets that opposed the establishment of an autonomous zone in Washington, D.C., similar to the one we see in Seattle. This divisiveness we are discussing here today is real. Companies are openly suggesting they support the free expression of ideas as long as they're the same as their own. This does nothing but undermine free speech and divide our nation. As we examine how online disinformation further exacerbates these issues and further divides our nation, we must realize the far-reaching consequences of our actions and policy proposals. To be clear, deliberately misleading anyone about medical treatments or sharing false information about the COVID-19 virus is dangerous and wrong. Spreading hate speech or disparaging others based on their race is also dangerous and it is wrong. On the other hand, when we discuss reforms to the internet, we must be deliberate. We cannot stifle the innovation which has given us the greatest tool the world has ever seen. Without the internet and social media, our spread of critical information related to COVID-19 would have been slowed and could have cost thousands of lives. Additionally, it was a social media post that first told the world about the death of George Floyd, and the protests and demonstrations that have followed take advantage of things like hashtags, Facebook groups, and live streaming to share with the world their message in a way that was not possible just a few years ago. Mr. Freed, a lot of the testimony we've heard is focused on reforms to Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. In your testimony, you lay out several reforms that you'd like to see in order to restore the original intent of the law while protecting free expression. If Congress does go too far, in your opinion, by regulating the internet, what are some of the risks we're taking? Would we be able to have the same sort of dialogues and civic engagement that we've come to enjoy on our social media platforms?
So the good news is I'm not proposing regulation, right? Regulation is usually limiting a business model in advance, saying you can't use your discretion. That's not the proposal on the table, right? What we're talking about is applying a duty of care. You have all the discretion you want in the front end. All we're saying is that if you make a bad decision, then you can be held culpable like every other business in America. I think that avoids the harm of regulation. We don't want to stifle innovation. We don't have to. Let them innovate, but if they innovate wrong, if they are careless and reckless, like every other business in America, they should be able to be held to account. If they're doing nothing wrong, and they often aren't, everything's fine. But when they are, we can't even question it. And that's offensive. So let's take the regulation off the table. I think we're going to chill innovation by holding them to the same duty of care as everybody else. We do have to be careful on speech. And so I think we've got to be very careful. It's a lot easier when you're focusing on illicit conduct. Maybe there's some room in the good faith requirement. If the courts give some meaning to that in a careful way about pretext, I think that can go a long way in solving some of our speech concerns.
That makes sense to me. And Mr. Flores asked you about some of your ideas under your quote reasonable good faith steps. But my question, I guess, would be how would that be enforced? What would that look like?
Sorry, again, was that Freed or Fareed? Is that for me?
That's for you, yes, sir.
Again, so every other company in America, right, is subject to a duty of care. They deal with it every day, and so they take reasonable steps. This would largely be self-enforcing. We'd be lining up incentives. If they're going to be reckless, right, if they're going to allow, they're not going to combat the distribution of drugs over their platforms. They're not going to do what every other business does to make sure their facilities aren't misused. They'll be held accountable. I don't think there's a lot to do other than to recreate the duty of care that applies to everybody else.
Thank you for that. And I'm running low on time, but Ms. Collins-Dexter, I want to ask you quickly, throughout your career, you've worked on many successful campaigns and initiatives. Could you share with us how social media has been utilized as a tool for your efforts, as well as for some current projects? How do you think various movements that seek to change society have benefited from an individual's ability to participate through social media?
Groups have always benefited from new technologies. It's extremely important as an opportunity for the voices of the unheard to be heard, whether it's through books, whether it's through media, whether it's through technology. And we've seen when left in the hands of corporations and it becomes unregulated, that actually those voices end up getting drowned out more and more. And so that is part of what we're seeing now in social media. Like, as we have not been regulating these companies, more and more this idea of what free speech looks like is operating on a sliding scale where it's free for some and costly for others.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes my good friend, Ms. Dengel, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Chairwoman Schakowsky, for holding this important hearing. And the good news for all the witnesses that by the time you get to me, it means you're getting close to the end. But this subject, this is something that's very important to me. And I want to say to my colleague, Mr. Hudson, it's not just the conservatives. The unions have in the last couple of weeks sent a letter. Facebook's taken down the use of the word unionization, which has been very disturbing with the UAW, because it was being taken down from sites where some really specific issues were being discussed. So I want my colleagues to know it's really an issue on both sides. How do we talk about it and how do we define it? And I am worried about how disinformation spreads like wildfire. And I'm trying to figure out, how do we address it? How do we protect that free speech? But so, for instance, I've been to many protests over the last 2 weeks. I don't look like someone who have been at 17 of them, but I have. And I have had several people come up to me. I had a constituent who was suspended from Facebook for a week for saying that people were going to die because they weren't wearing masks. And yet somebody else who had been at that vigil had threatened with guns. She was suspended for a week, and Facebook did not take down the "I have guns, I can protect." There's an inconsistency here that just makes you have no metrics by which to judge how they're making decisions. And I would really beg to differ with that. But let me start with Ms. Collins-Dexter. have you seen other examples of platforms not applying their terms of services in a uniform fashion? And have you seen an uptick in these kind of disparities in recent months?
Absolutely. I think to be clear, all of the platforms have demonstrated some level of issue with applying the rules unevenly, particularly when it comes to more prominent figures.
Mr. Freed, I can see you nodding your head too, so.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's easy to pick on Facebook. They're the biggest, but all the services from Reddit to TikTok to YouTube to Google to Twitter, they're all struggling under the weight, but it's their weight. They built these things at scale and at a speed without putting the proper safeguards in place. So they don't then get to turn around and say, well, the internet's really big, the problems are really hard. You built this mess and now you have to fix it.
And Congresswoman Spencer Overton, just one thing here. It's definitely debatable about content and what should be regulated, definitely, by the platforms. The issue, though, is that these are private entities. And so, for example, when the president talks about free speech, free speech is really about government, right? And so if we were to basically say Facebook had to have everything, they couldn't remove threats, harassment, altered video, misinformation, sexual privacy invasions, etc. So we definitely want transparency and more consistent content moderation. But I do think that us simply saying, hey, all of this is free speech opens the door to a lot of negative hate speech and a lot of, violations of basic civil rights here that, we don't want to occur.
I agree with you. And I have another question I want to ask, and I'm running out of time, but I really fear that the internet has become a tool of fear and hatred. And whenever I talk about the Second Amendment, the death threats that I get that aren't taken down are sort of stunning. But Mr. Fareed, I'm running out of time. Arizona's seen a spike in daily COVID cases. At the beginning of this month, there were roughly 200 new cases per day. Today, that number is over 3,500 daily new cases. Yesterday, President Trump held an event in Phoenix, which is a new COVID hotspot. Thousands of people attended the event without wearing masks and without socially distancing. When asked why they weren't taking the precautions, they told reporters that they didn't believe the number of reported deaths, that they were overstated, and they didn't believe in the severity of the disease. Given your research, what do you make of these statements? And do you believe that online platforms are doing enough to curtail the deadly and misinformation?
So first of all, I don't think they're doing enough. And we've seen this. We've seen the misinformation apocalypse, and we've seen it propagate down to where people are making decisions that are affecting their health and their neighbor health and those in this country. And I think that is a deadly consequence of allowing this type of misinformation to propagate through the services.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Chair now recognizes Mr. Gianforte for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the panelists. This has been a very good discussion. I created my business on the back of the internet in the early 2000s. We eventually grew that from an extra bedroom in our home to one of the largest employers in Montana. We had 1,100 employees globally. And our website had about 8 million unique visitors every single day. We're a good example that the internet has removed geographic barriers that previously prevented global businesses from operating in rural Montana and rural America. But the internet can also have negative effects. Platforms can amplify similar voices and stifle others without much clarity. In a time when many were forced indoors, misinformation had an even more disastrous effect. I understand how important Section 230 can be, especially for a small business which doesn't have the resources of a large one. It's an important shield. It also comes with a sword. There's been concern that certain companies are using their size to stifle certain voices. I believe it might be a lack of understanding by companies based in Silicon Valley. Back in March of last year, Missoula-based Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation reached out to my office because one of their advertisements had been denied by Google over concerns of animal cruelty.
The ad featured a woman talking about growing up hunting with her dad. There were no dead animals. There was no animal cruelty. It promoted our hunting heritage. As an avid hunter and outdoorsman myself, I know how many Montanans rely on hunting to provide for food for their families and as a way to enjoy our great outdoors. Many businesses in Montana promote hunting and fishing, as it is their means to sell their outdoor sporting goods products. Will their businesses be denied the opportunity to advertise on a platform that owns a large portion of the market? Will they have to reach out to their member of Congress every time there's a, quote, misunderstanding? Well, there have been some troubling examples. I've appreciated the quick response and willingness to engage from these platforms. We got the problem fixed. It just took a lot of work. It's difficult to regulate a dynamic industry, and hastily rushed to draft legislation could have more unintended consequences than solutions. Mr. Freed, in your testimony, you pointed to ways we can work together for a solution. I'm interested in what effect you think over prescriptive legislation, what sort of negative impacts would overly prescriptive legislation have on the sector?
I think that was me. So
yeah,
that was for me. Continue.
Yeah.
I really am not advocating regulation, right? We want all the experimentation. We want business models like the ones you talked about for your business. That's the innovation, right? And so you get the experimentation by not regulating. You get protection for free expression from the safe harbor of C2. What we need to do is just say, innovate, experiment, but know that you're going to be held accountable for your own decisions. Every other business does that. It's personal responsibility, it's business responsibility. That will solve a lot of this. We don't have to be prescriptive. And the other beauty of this is you don't have to come up with different legislative solutions for every single ill on the internet. If you line up the incentives, the platforms will solve their own problems because they don't want to be sued, right? That's what every other business does. We don't have to decide there's a solution for this and a solution for that. Make them accountable for their own actions like every other business is.
Okay, thank you. And just as a follow-on to that, Montana is a small business state. Innovation often happens in these small businesses. I'm concerned as we look at public policy here that as small businesses compete with large businesses, that, and I understand your concept of duty of care, how should that apply differently for small businesses versus large business so we don't stifle, the duty of care doesn't create a duty of burden so big that small companies can't actually innovate?
So the great news is it already is sort of, it solves its own problem. Reasonableness is a flexible standard. And certainly a large company with lots of resources, what's reasonable for that company is different than what's reasonable for a small company, right? So the reasonableness standard will adjust to the size of the platform. Again, the small startup doesn't have as many users to moderate, isn't in 12 lines of business, has fewer uses. So if it starts knowing I'm accountable for what I do, it will build responsibility by design. It'll start small and responsible. And as it grows, it will have added resources to deal with other issues as they pop up.
Thank you, Mr. Gentleman's time is expired. Thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes Ms. Blunt Rochester for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the other chair and ranking members, to the panelists, especially Professor Overton, who I've had an opportunity to work with on future work issues. I say thank you. I'm struggling a little with this hearing because of the significance and the timeliness of it. I think back to when we had this conversation about Section 230 months ago, and the fact that at that time we talked about the lack of diversity and inclusion in some of these platforms and in some of these companies, and how even when we talk about algorithms or we talk about humans who are have biases, that it impacts what we get out of this this system. And now we are facing COVID-19, a pandemic on top of a pandemic, while we address racial and social issues that our country has long been plagued with. And what these platforms do are magnify the current situation. And as we've seen, they're also exploiting and and actually just really making things worse. And while there are good portions of the internet and good things about these platforms, one of the challenges now is that we have a sense of urgency. The questions now are life and death. People can die if there's misinformation out there about COVID-19. People can die if violence is incited in people and they go out because of what they're reading on these platforms that are artificially targeting them. And our democracy can die. So the sense of urgency I have, while today, what is beautiful is that I'm hearing Democrats and Republicans all say, we have to face this. But what I really want to say is to those platforms and to those tech companies, we're putting you on notice. This is our country, and this is really important. And so for this moment, a lot of Americans, millions are asking themselves individually and collectively, what can I do? And so I'm hoping that Mark Zuckerberg and Reddit and YouTube, everybody, you're holding up a mirror to yourselves. I'm going to ask a question. First of all, I'm going to share, Mr. Chairman, I've submitted a letter into the record to Mr. Zuckerberg, supported by 42 members of Congress and by leading civil rights organizations, including the Leadership Conference, Color of Change, and the Joint Center. And I hope that this committee will consider having Mr. Zuckerberg in, and that he will see this moment as a wake-up call. And in that line, I wanted to mention that
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, sir. In 2018, Facebook hired an independent third party to conduct a civil rights audit. And we now have the results of the first two. And Ms. Collins-Dexter, the second audit report underscores the changes in policy Facebook was to take to address voter suppression. And the independent auditor stated that Facebook would implement new policies to further address these issues, such as an explicit ban on don't vote ads. Has Facebook followed through on these new policies?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Facebook has not been consistent on following through on what they need to do. And I want to be clear, Facebook brought in Laura Murphy, formerly of the ACLU, to conduct a third-party audit. She did an Airbnb audit, which resulted in clear changes that still exist to this day, including infrastructure, permanent civil rights infrastructure. She at Facebook appears to have been, I feel like, blocked at every turn in terms of like what she recommends and how we see that play out in terms of like policy implementation. And though we've seen them move baby steps forward, we have no faith that they're actually going to go nearly as far as they need to. And to your point, the stakes are so incredibly high right now. We have to move with urgency.
Thank you. And then on the question of violent speech, the chairman has already pointed out the statement of the president, when the looting starts, the shooting starts, and that Mr. Zuckerberg refused to take that comment down. Ms. Collins-Dexter, please explain how this irresponsible policy by Facebook has the real potential to turn into violence.
We've seen people directly impacted by violence in real ways. We've seen hate crimes go up significantly. We have had a lot of threats directed at us. I've had threats directed at me. The stakes are super real. And one thing I do want to say too, like we talk about regulation as stifling innovation. I think at its best when government steps in and actually lays a new lay of the land and makes something possible, like through the New Deal and other moments in time, we see that innovation actually runs free. And I think that's what we need to be doing right now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlelady. Chair now recognizes Mr. Carter for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of our panelists for being here today. We appreciate it. Great discussion. I want to start with you, Mr. Freed, Neil. When we talk about online disinformation, I think it's important for us to note where we're at and how this applies to the COVID-19 pandemic right now. I think that's very important because a lot of the disinformation, particularly in regards to false health benefits, is very troublesome. And I wanted to ask you, I've got a bill, it's called the Combating Pandemic Scams Act, and it really requires the federal government to push out best practices and awareness and really requires them to assimilate information about some of these scams and put them on in a database and put them online so people can learn about it. How do you see this fitting into the larger online picture of disinformation?
I think it would be great to have that database. There's an impediment right now, which is who is data would be very valuable to feed into that database. When we see patterns of misinformation coming from particular websites or particular names, they're often bogus names, but there's pattern recognition here. If you see a certain name associated with every single misinformation site about COVID in a certain time span, cybersecurity experts can say, aha, here's a pattern. Next time we see information coming from this website, let's be suspect. That helps law enforcement. That's helps cyber experts. It might even help algorithms, right? If we want to prioritize or deprioritize, it helps to know, is this a site that's likely purveying misinformation? But we've lost access to a lot of who is data because of GDPR. I'd love to get that data back so we can build exactly those sorts of databases.
Do you think it's important for the public to be brought up to date and to be kept up to date with this kind of information on these kind of ongoing scams?
Sure, and actually there still are some databases, but they're growing stale because we're losing access to that who is data.
Let me ask you another question. On June 22nd, the Wall Street Journal editorial board put out a piece about how the recent social justice movement has begun to move organizations to punish people for exercising their First Amendment rights on social media platforms. And we've talked about that all throughout this discussion today, and we all understand what a difficult place we're in and how this can be done, but it's got to be done carefully. We all understand that, but despite the fact that some of the opinions were not negative in any ways, they were still removed. Do you see a danger here? Do you see a danger of online platforms potentially creating a mentality or a pathway that could compromise people's First Amendment rights?
As you point out, we have to be very sensitive when we're talking about speech. I think that the best solution there is what a lot of both the witnesses and the members have talked about, which is first, transparency. What are the policies, right? Second, what are the terms of service, right? What are the standards going to be? And process, right? Who's been taken down for what reason? How can they appeal that? If we can track that information, some sort of like often we get from the platforms transparency reports. Some of this is probably already being gathered. That kind of transparency will make sure we know why someone's being taken down. If there's been a mistake, how they can fix it, and we can see patterns over time. Then maybe we know, has there been good faith? Has there not been good faith?
We've been talking about this subject for quite a while, for a long time. Even when you were still on committee, we were talking about it. And the message that I think we're all giving to the platform owners and to those running the platforms is you need to do it to yourself before we have to do it to you. And I don't know how we get that message across to them. I don't know. I don't want to have to do that. I don't want the federal government, because I'm really fearful that we're going to suppress innovation, and I don't want to see us do that. So that's my concern here. Let me ask you one final question. Combating disinformation is certainly important. And I believe it's also important to note that the suppression of real information doesn't fit a political narrative. For instance, there are some media platforms that like to emphasize the good things that the governor of New York has been doing, and he has been doing some good things. But they fail to mention some of the things like putting patients in nursing homes, putting COVID-19 patients infected in nursing home, which is the absolute worst thing you could do. How do you balance between that? How do we balance on both sides of the aisle between them?
Again, let's track what's happening and why, because that's how we analyze data and figure out what really is happening. And then it's back to the marketplace of ideas, right? The more platforms there are, the more avenues for expression, you make sure that the good data comes out, and those will attract consumers. And again, that's the benefit of keeping C2, right? Keeping the content moderation safe harbor of 230. So we have all those platforms, all those opinions expressed. Just make sure that if there's something really nefarious happening, there's accountability for the platform.
Gentlemen's time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes Mr. Wahlberg for 5 minutes.
on there. There we go. There we go. Thanks for this hearing. It's something whose time has come. Let me follow up briefly on Leader Walden's interest in having Jack Dorsey back before the committee. I'd like to enter into the record a New York Times article from yesterday on how Mr. Dorsey, his financial transactions company Square, is withholding payments to thousands of small enterprises with little warning who are desperately in need of these funds to stay afloat during the pandemic. And when these folks attempted to use Mr. Dorsey's other company, Twitter, to complain, they were blocked. I'd like to have that entered.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Freed, it almost goes without saying in relation to your testimony that the courts have strayed away from the original congressional intent behind Section 230. The advocacy courts that we have today strayed away from a lot, so this shouldn't surprise us. Can you please explain how judicial interpretation of Section 230 over the last 2 decades has not squared with its purpose?
Sure, Congressman. So this really, as we, I think all know now, started as a libel case, right? And it was about Prodigy, who was doing the right thing, being a good Samaritan, missed something and was punished for it, right? They were essentially, were told, they weren't punished, but they could have been held culpable because of their good faith efforts. That's what I think got Congress's concerns. That's what led to, now Senator Wyden, Congressman Cox, to rightly point out we had a misincentive. We were actually discouraging people from moderating. That's what this law was supposed to be about. Unfortunately, it was written in a way that's been interpreted to do much more than that. It doesn't just, so the first problem is it doesn't just protect the good Samaritan that's doing content moderation. It protects those that are doing no content moderation, inadequate content moderation, and the bad Samaritans. That's the first problem. It also has grown way beyond defamation, right? So now we know it's applying to almost every gig economy, sex trafficking, other than Sesta Fosta now, still have a problem with child pornography, sexually explicit materials, sale of drugs. And this C1 provision is being used to apply to all of that. That was never anybody's intention. Unfortunately, the language is amenable to that interpretation, which is why if we fix C1, I think a lot of our problems get a lot better. It doesn't make everything go away, but I think even just that change, and it can be modest, can make a lot of good and help a lot of these problems that every witness here is saying is a problem. It's every witness here, it's most witnesses at most of the panels and hearings you've been having, and it's all the victims, right? All of us are saying the status quo isn't working, something has to change.
Yeah, and seeing the nodding of heads, I think we are in agreement on that and needs to move forward. Let me, Mr. Freed, you put forward in your proposal, in your testimony, that Congress should consider amending. And I think we've all talked about amending 230 to add reasonable duty of care in order to earn the liability protections under law. And we've discussed that quite a bit today, but could you expand on any key guiding principles that ought to be there for Congress to consider in retaining and modifying the liability protections in Section 230? The guiding principles, those overriding guiding principles.
Save C2. Content moderation safe harbor is important. That was the goal. Let's save that. Let's not try and regulate everything, right? We don't want a patchwork, right? That would be harmful. But if you write the incentives and recognize the difference between speech and illicit conduct, I think those are the guiding principles, right? So add to that transparency, and I think you can make a modest change to 230 that fixes the problem, but saves all the benefit that has led to what is a wonderful internet. I mean, I don't want to be seen as a Luddite. The internet is great, but we can keep the great parts of the internet and fix the problems from a misincentive in Section 230.
Thank you. I'll yield my time.
Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. I note that Mr. Sarbanes has waved on to the committee, and it gives me great pleasure now to recognize him for 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Excellent. Well, thank you for the opportunity to participate in this hearing. Really outstanding panel. I appreciate all the testimony. I've been listening for the last 2 or 3 hours because it's a very important topic. So we know that hostile actors, both foreign and domestic, sadly have grown quite sophisticated in exploiting these platforms, these social media platforms, to sow discord, to widen political division, and far too often, as we've heard, to suppress people's vote. Yet, as this hearing has shown, these platforms have been reluctant to deploy the full suite of their proven tools to combat the known threat. And it just doesn't have to be this way, from what I understand. While not perfect, the platform's response to the COVID-19 outbreak has at least given us a rough roadmap for how they can proactively, and I emphasize that word, proactively provide users with accurate information about our democracy, about our elections, while keeping harmful misinformation designed to suppress the vote from spreading on its apps and on their platforms and so forth. For example, Facebook's efforts at addressing COVID-19 have included sending correct information to users and notifying them when they've interacted with false information. So there are steps that they can take. Professor Farid, simply as a matter of technological capacity for the moment, can Facebook and the other platforms direct users to verified sources of information for those users who are known to interact with false information about voting?
Absolutely. I mean, these are the ultimate data collecting and intelligence collecting corporations. They have a phenomenal amount of information of who we are, what we watch, what we see, and they absolutely have the technological and the data ability to inform us when we have been interacted with harmful content. Now, it remains to be seen if that is in fact helpful. Does correcting the record actually deal with the harms that happened earlier on? And there's some contradictory evidence in the literature that simply trying to correct the record will undo everything. That's just not the way human nature works. There's a boomerang effect. So my preference is to avoid the contact in the beginning, but if it does happen, this is absolutely unnecessary, but it may not be a sufficient step.
I agree with you. I think we need both. I think you all have given powerful testimony as why you need that kind of front end response to disinformation, to try to protect the users from these things that can sow division and otherwise, in effect, distort our democracy. But it's clear that they have the tools to do this, both on the front end, if, as you testified earlier, they're willing to put the resources and attention behind it in a meaningful way, but also as evidenced by the way they've handled the COVID-19 disinformation, provide good, positive, corrected information on the back end when that is necessary and called for. Professor Overton, this discussion, I guess, begs the question, if the capacity exists for Facebook and these other platforms to have that kind of a response in their toolkit, what, from your perspective, can explain their reluctance to do it?
Well, thanks for your leadership in terms of empowering small voices, in terms of small donors, number one, in terms of public financing. So just wanted to note that. I think, again, as Dr. Farid talked about, there are these financial incentives that companies have to look the other way, to basically say, hey, we'll sell this ad that is targeted, employment ad that's targeted to whites and away from blacks. We'll sell this ad that's targeted at Black communities in terms of voter suppression without a lot of scrutiny. So I think these financial incentives are there, and that we need some other incentives like regulatory incentives possibly to address it.
Thank you. Ms. Collins-Dexter, in the time I have left, in addition to proactively notifying users when they interacted with false information, do you think Facebook and other platforms should take the additional and affirmative steps of labeling or removing posts when that platform is being used for voter suppression and disinformation?
Absolutely. We find in our organizing work that when disinformation gets out, even if you correct it or put a label over it, people retain the lie more than the truth. So the content, I think, should come down. I think we also need to look at who are the verified users and how they may be pushers of disinformation, and what are the consequences for that.
Thank you very much.
Time has expired. I thank the gentleman. I want to thank my co-chair, Jen Shankowski, for her good work, and our ranking member, Bob Latta, and all the members. And I especially want to thank this outstanding panel. We have really enjoyed your testimony and the way you've responded to our questions. I want to remind all members that pursuant to our committee rules, that they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record to be answered by the witnesses who have appeared. And I ask each witness to respond promptly to any such questions that you may receive. Before we adjourn, I'd like to request unanimous consent to enter the following the following documents into the record. First, a letter from the National Hispanic Media Coalition, a letter from the Coalition for a Safer Web, a letter from CCIA and NetChoice, a letter from Steve Sanderson, Executive Director of NYU Center for Social Media and Politics, a letter from Public Knowledge, a statement from the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, an essay by Mr. Spencer Overton, a Wall Street article, Facebook executive shut down efforts to make the site less divisive, a letter to Facebook on civil rights issues from Representative Lisa Blunt, Rochester, and others, a letter from the Lithuanian American community, a letter from the Central and Eastern European Coalition, research from Debunk EU on disinformation, letter from the Open Technology Institute, a letter from Consumer Reports, and last but not least, an article from the New York Times entitled Square Jack Dorsey's Pay Service is Withholding Money Merchants Say They Need. Without objection, so ordered. And at this time, the committee is adjourned.
Thank you all. Thanks for your leadership.
Thank you, panelists.